Travis Ekbom.
Ethan Nagel.
Welcome to the show, brother.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I know this is great. For everyone watching, Travis has been a good friend of mine since high school. Very involved in GOP politics, very involved in Minnesota politics, GOP party, all that kind of stuff. So fair warning, I guess, to the listeners or my subscribers or whoever's listening is obviously going to be a bit more GOP heavy, but we do want to talk about the legalities of just everything coming in. So this isn't a giant Trump parade, but we want to talk about the analysis of what's actually going to happen, what he's already done, the legalities, talk about some past stuff, but stuff like that. So if you want to listen in, get a little, info, entertainment.
I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to be providing legal analysis per se, but we're going to be touching on some legal topics.
Well, neither are the political commentators. Well,
most of them. Well,
so. Actually, some are lawyers.
Some are lawyers, some aren't.
Yeah, exactly. So. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah.
No, Travis is awesome. He's you're a CFO of a company.
Yes.
Yeah, very successful. And then also you've tried running for Congress a few times.
Well, I ran for Congress once. I've run for a couple other offices, more local here in Minnesota. So I've been involved in the GOP for about 20 years. I that's my background, I guess, why I'm poised here to provide some insight onto the Minnesota Republican Party and Republican politics in general. So.
Awesome, sweet. So let's just kick it off. What was you were talking? This is a podcast. I'll do whatever. What did you suggest we start out with? I just went through the list here. You were like, start with this one.
Well, you had just showed me a list of some things that you wanted to cover, and I thought, well, we'd probably start with just a quick update. I was just asked the other day at a local meeting to provide an update on some of the Minnesota GOP stuff. So I saw that was on your list, and I thought, well, let's knock that out.
Yeah, let's knock that
away.
out. So Minnesota GOP. So, and I think you've talked about this too. We talked about probably a few weeks before the election in November. I think maybe the summer, on kind of how the GOP party is in general nationally, but then the Minnesota GOP. It's like they're not until this run in July is when you started seeing Turning Point USA, a bunch of younger generations getting into it. Charlie Kirk, you have who else? There's some others that were getting out there that really got out there. Yeah, and to move the youth vote. Conservatives aren't typically youthful. They're not super not activist type, but
there's been a long history of sort of the silent conservative. So conservatives were a minority among the youth, and then even within that group, they were usually more afraid to speak up. And I can speak from my own shameful personal experience. When I was a teenager or right in college, I had conservative beliefs, but I didn't want to talk about them. And even if I wanted to, I didn't really know where I could find people to talk to them about. So yeah, I went to college, and occasionally I'd find another conservative when we'd be able to talk about stuff. But we did not have something like Turning Point USA establishing chapters on college campuses. I started off at the University of Wisconsin, and there was a college Republicans chapter, but they were more or less inactive. They existed. They met once a month or something like that, but they didn't do anything. So what's really interesting is, as they've been doing exit polling or as they've been polling people since Trump's re-election here, a couple months ago now in November, somewhere between 60 and 70% of voters under the age of 30 voted for Trump. So we're talking.
That's a giant shift.
Yeah. We're talking a significant majority of young people voted for Trump. And I think part of that is just, yes, people like Charlie Kirk making it okay to speak up if you're a conservative. Those conservatives speak up, and it becomes very clear that the liberal and leftist students on campus don't have arguments, and then those kind of persuadable students hear both arguments or hear one set of arguments and realize the other side doesn't have any, or just realize one side's getting bullied and say, all right, well, you know what, maybe I shouldn't just go on with the sort of inertia of government good. Maybe I should have a little skepticism about taxes, and maybe I should ask some questions about abortion, issues like that.
Well, it's not sexy. I always say that, it's not. And I think traditionally for a long time, it just never is. I mean, people, it's like the Shane Gillis joke, no one ever came out of college and, wanted to be a dick or be a conservative, now I'm pissed or whatever, But I think, and it's, that's the stereotype, but in generalities, when it comes, you're conserving, you're traditional. When you're young, you want to make a difference too. That's always I got to find a cause. I got to, and that's
probably another component, because when you say that, I've always struggled with, do I call myself a conservative or not these last few years? Because what do I want to conserve? I don't want to conserve the Department of Labor. I don't want to conserve the Department of Education. I don't want to conserve Roe v. Wade. I don't want to conserve the FBI. I don't want to conserve 90% of what the status quo is. So I'm the radical change agent.
Yeah. But you say traditions, though, then. You'd almost say traditional.
Right, yeah. You'd probably say,
Because that's, you think of the old, like, We Love America, USA, 4th of July.
Yes.
You know, that, American Pie, that kind of stuff is what conservative, traditional, I'll say values. But you're right, because that word does get kind of construed of, like, what are you conserving? Because you used to want to conserve different things, but now those things have shifted to now it's where the conservatives or the conservatives, but the Republicans.
And simultaneously, we will say the 1980s, for example. We will say Reagan was the paramount conservative in the United States, and we will simultaneously say Brezhnev was a conservative Soviet. Like, well, there's no policy overlap between Brezhnev and Reagan. So how can we call them both conservative? And the reality is, Brezhnev was trying to maintain this communist order in the Soviet Union, and Reagan was, to the point you just made, trying to appeal back to older American traditions. He was trying to return us from the
70s or the 60s,
the
70s.
60s and 70s. Really, basically anything post Roosevelt. Anything Roosevelt, Truman on through Carter, he was trying to say, like, all right, we're going to basically eviscerate this. Yeah.
And let's say, so that's on the national scale. And I said, and it definitely, the winds had shifted, especially in you could feel it like come the beginning of the year. And obviously everyone's revving up though, so that makes sense. So you're seeing the efforts being put in. But I think it's also, like I said, it never was like that. Like, I mean, you go 10, 12 years ago, one, it was never as polarizing as it is today. Like in generalities, politics is very polarizing. So it wasn't nearly as polarizing as it was 12 years ago, because you could have conservative friends. You go to college, like I remember having good youthful debates. And people were like, cool, let's go grab a beer. Like, we're just having a beer, and everyone's like, cool, all right, man. It wasn't
existential.
It wasn't existential. Yeah, exactly.
Politics was a separate thing.
Yeah, and most people didn't even talk. It was like, that's boring and stupid. Like,
most people didn't want to engage in it.
Yeah. So, but now it's completely taboo. Like, you bring it starts decisive, or it's divisive completely. Starts like putting fissures and everything.
Well, and I think there might be a degree of healthiness to that, in the sense that we became desensitized to just how badly we had fallen into a rut.
Yeah.
That's what I always say. There's two kinds of conservatives in the Republican Party. There's the status quo conservatives, who I've kind of been describing that use of the word conservative. And then there's the conservatives who are that more traditional, like almost libertarian in many regards, or they want radical change that brings us back to what we used to be.
I feel like the libertarian that's that weird kind of, those two are coming together, and libertarians are, it's funny, you see them talk, it's just chaos. But then it has the Libertarian
Party is a mess.
It's a mess. But then people are like, well, this, and it's like, well, now you're leaning conservative, and then conservatives are leaning libertarian. So there's this like weird, a lot of overlap.
It's called fusionism.
Yeah, the fusion.
And so that was really the term in the late 20th century. William F. Buckley, I think, is more or less seen as the architect of fusionism, where he was going to take the libertarian economic policies and couple them to the more traditional or conservative. I don't like the term social policy, because I don't really, give me some examples of policies that aren't social. Like, I don't know what that means. But the moral agenda of the, and I don't think we should shy away from that word. Like, these are moral conflicts. And so let's go ahead and say you have the economic component and the moral component. And fusionism brought those two together and said, okay, well, we're going to cut taxes, but we're also going to be pro-life and oppose abortion. And that synthesis is really what Reagan was able to play on bringing together those schools of thought to win in landslides that we haven't seen since.
So. Well, I was saying, so that was the other thing that we're getting into. So the GOP, like I said, it doesn't, and you express this frustration, we'll get into it. So like nationally, people weren't exactly getting out, I don't say getting out the vote, but it didn't feel like a lot of inertia. Now take that to the Minnesota GOP, which I remember you telling me, they don't even care. Like they're like, well, this is how we always done things. And I remember you telling me, like, they're lost. Like, before the election, before before the big, obviously the national, but the local, it feels disheartening a little bit. Maybe
very
there's
much so.
It's more probably invigorated now, but it's
especially because so back in December we had our state central committee meeting, and that's where state central delegates elect the party leadership for the state of Minnesota. So the chair, the deputy chair, the secretary, treasurer. There might be another position that's not coming to me off the top of my head. And at the December state central meeting, the sitting chair was ousted and replaced by a new man named Alex Plekish, who's a retired Marine colonel. So, and then the deputy chair is also a retired Marine. So I am not a veteran, but we're getting back into your wheelhouse here with the way this is going. So, and that the ousted chair really had just a lot of missteps and did not seem to be great at handling conflict. And his from what I can tell, his approach to conflict was generally to try and avoid it. And that that led to people feeling left out of the loop. That led to some unresolved issues. That led to some heavy-handedness. And with all of those things combined, he was ultimately removed. So there's a bit of a spirit of renewal here in the Minnesota GOP, which has had, over the last 10 years, scandals, corruption, lost election after lost election. And now we have a new leader who's very, very sort of outside of the traditional leadership of he's not a former state senator, he's not a former state house member, he doesn't come from that pedigree. Yeah. So he brings a different business-centered mindset. Very much, I'm sure he would consider himself kind of coming with that Trump flavor of I'm going to bring that pragmatic business sense, not, well, I know how to work in a legislature.
Yeah. And like you said, you're seeing the revival a little bit in the Minnesota, but even then, I remember your frustrations for the upcoming, like they're just not getting it out. That just feels like it's stale. It's old. It's like they're doing the old strategies. It doesn't work, but they're like, well, what was it? You were like, well, the conservatives, they'll go out and vote. It's like the old thing, like, oh, don't worry, we'll get out and vote.
Very specifically,
just that mentality.
That was a conversation I had with a former gubernatorial candidate from 2022, and I asked him, I said, what are you going to do? This was. So 2022, we've been through George Floyd. We had the riots. There was still, if you can remember all the way back 4 years ago or 3 years ago, there was still this sort of prevailing mindset that America's a white supremacist country. And I said to him, what are you going to do to break through to suburban women and get them to vote for you if you're the Republican nominee? And he said, oh, they're just going to look at how bad crime is in the city and they're going to vote for me. I said, well, He's still thinking of suburban women as boomers. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I just mean he's thinking of that age group. That age demographic. Yeah. It's like, no, I'm 38. My generation are the soccer moms. And I'm telling you, I went to a Lutheran high school and a Baptist university, and I'm looking at the people who are ostensibly should be the conservative moms, and they are absolutely convinced that America is perpetrating a genocide. So they're not just going to say, well, I heard somebody's car got broken into at the grocery store. I guess I'll vote Republican now. They're thinking this is something where if they don't vote Democrat, they're complicit in a new Holocaust. So,
So that was like the frustrations they were dealing with.
That was the frustration I was dealing with then,
Yeah. But now it feels like it's maybe a little more momentum.
Yes. I'd say the capital has been exhausted from that radical leftist.
Yeah. What's going on now? Because I follow a little bit now because I'm on X. But there's some of the Minnesota feed comes up and there's some issues with some stuff switch over. There's like weird stuff going on. There's like, is there some Democrat that's under like this got arrested for something or?
Okay, so there was a
I don't know. I've just saw a little feed. I'm like, what?
There was a Democrat legislator who last year got arrested for breaking into her stepmother or mother-in-law, I don't remember now, breaking into her house. She drove like 4 hours to get to the house. She was dressed all in like a black turtleneck and a balaclava and broke in and ended up getting arrested. But the Democrats wouldn't remove her because that would cost them a vote, and they didn't want to do that. And now she, I think, is facing trial now. And then what just happened recently in this most recent election is it turns out that the Democrat candidate in, I think it was District 40B, did not actually live in the district.
Oh, okay.
And I was just reading, I think the Star Tribune said something like there were he did not meet all residency requirements clearly or something like that. It was like, no, he didn't live there. It's not. This isn't something where, well, he moved in. He rented a place and then moved in one day after the cutoff where you have to be there. It is no. He didn't live there. Yeah. He rented an apartment. He didn't even get electricity turned on to it. He never went to it. It was obvious that he didn't live there. Mm-hmm. So a judge, I don't remember if he rescinded or just refused to issue him a election certification. And so now there's going to be a special election there, but the governor issued the writ of election before he was legally allowed to do so. So now the special election has been canceled, and they're going to reschedule a new special election. All of this while the Minnesota State House is tied 67-67 between Democrats and Republicans.
That's as of November, or that's...
Right. Yeah, well, and so now it's actually 67-66 because that guy was not legally elected. So so Republicans have the advantage. Republicans therefore want to basically initiate the legislative session, put in their Speaker of the House, put in their leadership, and then start forming committees. And Democrats are boycotting, refusing to go to the Capitol building.
Okay, that's what it was. I saw that little tweet or whatever. It was like they refused to. I was like, I don't know what's going on, but I saw something.
In fact, they rather than be sworn in at the Capitol, which is what you're supposed to have happen, they found a retired Democrat judge and conducted a midnight ceremony away from the Capitol building, and then told everybody, well, secretly, we all swore ourselves in the other night. So, well, this is preposterous.
Yeah.
So
I think the national, everyone thinks it's weird, but sometimes you dive into like the local state, and it's like kind of off the rails. Like you got that like the Parks and Rec mentality, like goofiness of it all, and they're like, no, that's real. Like I talked to somebody, they were like, I was like, yeah, he works at Parks and Rec. We went to high school with him, Stephen Hart. I was like, oh, is
really?
it like, yeah, he works for the Prior Lake Parks and Rec.
Oh, okay.
And it was, Prior Lake. And I was like, hey, how's everything going? He's like, oh, good. And I was like, oh, is it like the show? He's like, yeah. And like it wasn't like a joking, like, oh, the show is fun. He's like, no. He's like, it is.
Yeah. I remember there was an episode of Parks and Rec where a lady comes in and talks to Ron, and she says, there are signs in the park that say, do not drink the sprinkler water. So I made sun tea with it, and now I have a urinary tract infection. And I have to say, just being involved in politics on any level, the emails and phone calls that I've gotten from people that are, I mean, that's not parody. That is the kind of thing that you get from people. And Anyway,
so that's the status. So that's the current state of the Minnesota GOP. They're kind of getting their stuff together.
On intra-party, as far as like the party management, we're getting our stuff together. And as far as the state impact, or the state elected officials in the state legislature, they've been preparing themselves for a legal battle here because we just don't know how this is all going to shake out.
Really. Actually, there was a kid I grew up with. I shouldn't say kid anymore because we're all grown up. I think it was Drew? No, it was his brother. No, Drew. Troy. Sorry, I hung out with Troy. Drew Roach. I saw on my Facebook. He is one of the Minnesota senators, not Congress. That's how much I
Minnesota
don't.
State.
Minnesota State senator. He's like, I'm a Republican senator now. He's like from like Northfield, and I'm like, Drew Roach. Oh, that's awesome, And then like I went to his website. I just like heard an audio thing. I was like, yeah, that's Drew Roach. It was like really funny. He's like, I'm a family. I got 3 kids or whatever, and I'm like, that's cool. Like we grew up running around Burnsville, and I have hilarious stories with him and his brother. But so
ones I'm sure he'd rather not get shared.
They're more funny. They're more like nothing wild, but it's just the stuff they do anyways. But they just kick the crap out of each other. They were like, he was the older brother.
Oh sure.
And Drew would always, I was friends with Drew, and we were kind of the 2 fat kids, but like, so Troy would make fun of him, I was friends with Troy. Drew was the older brother. So Drew would always make fun of Troy, because Troy was like fat. He was like, not as fat as me. I was pretty big. But so we were like 2 fat kids, and we loved playing football and hanging out, whatever. But we all played together, but I think Troy was a year or 2 older, and they would just wail on each other. And what they would do, I told the man this, they would, all their shirts, their neck, their whatever, the collar.
Yeah.
Were all like stretched out with teeth marks. So even if it was washed, because what they do is right before they would beat the crap out of each other all the time. And before they do, they go, and then they would just go, and then They just start wailing, and I'd be playing video games, and they would just like 5 fights would break out in like 2 hour span of us playing video games. They're always beating on each other.
Being a kid, man.
I know. Anyways, one of them's now a Minnesota State Senator.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're both married, have kids, so that's great. But so that's awesome. So okay, good to go. Kind of getting the Minnesota feel and the GOP and whatnot. Move on nationally.
Sure. Yeah.
So what? We have a list here that we go through.
Go through.
What do you want to? What do you want? Why don't we start with some of the fun stuff? So the 36 felonies and legalities.
Oh, that's going to get thrown out.
Yeah.
There's no. So
let's explain. Like start from the beginning. So because even with myself, I'm like, okay, I think it's very, from the get go.
Sure.
Even the AG out of New York was like, we shouldn't even take this case.
So the district attorney in New York,
or the DA, sorry.
The district attorney in New York, Melvin Bragg, he said that. So let me give you the legal context here first. Yeah. President Trump may or may not have had an affair with a woman named Stormy Daniels.
Yep.
My understanding is he still denies that it took place.
Yep.
But he paid her money to shut up and go away.
Yep.
The way that money was paid. He told his attorney to make the problem go away, and his attorney decided to take company money and use it to pay her hush money so that she would go away. He then entered that as a business expense in the company's ledger. Whether or not the case was then made that constituted an illegal campaign contribution to Donald Trump's campaign for president, and that it was fraudulent bookkeeping. Now, there's really no doubt that it was fraudulent bookkeeping. The questions that come from that then are, is Donald Trump ultimately responsible for it, or is the attorney responsible for it because he's the one who did it? And I'll say that while the attorney is undoubtedly responsible in some capacity, Donald Trump, at the end of the day, it's his business. He's responsible for what happens in it. So I don't think you can say he's totally immune from that. But the issue is that that's a misdemeanor. So you're talking about facing a fine for doing this.
Yeah.
And beyond that, by the time the charges were brought, the misdemeanor statute of limitations had elapsed. So there was no charge that you could bring him with. However, if a misdemeanor is committed in the process of performing an underlying felony, then you can charge the misdemeanor as a felony as well. And so you might do that in order to extend somebody's sentence, or you might do that to boost the number of charges that they're facing so that you can plea bargain them down to a lower amount. There's reasons you might want to do that. The issue is this. You have to be able to identify an underlying felony. Now, remember, I said there was some speculation that might constitute an illegal campaign contribution. First off, no, it wouldn't. The Supreme Court's already ruled on that in regards to Jonathan Edwards, not Jonathan Edwards, John Edwards, when he ran for president.
Yep, I remember that too. That was when we were in high school. And I remember when all that fell apart.
Yeah. So, no, it wouldn't. But even if it did, that would be a federal issue, not something that the district attorney would be able to pursue. So, he brings these charges, labels them as felonies based on the bookkeeping. Even there, the 36 or whatever the number is. The way that he came up with that is you do things like, well, you entered it as a check, and then you processed the check. So there's 2, and that so it'd just be like the same check becomes 6 felonies or what have you. So when he announces, this is back, I think April 2024. Maybe it was March or April 2024, he announces all the felonies that they're going to charge Trump with. And he's asked, well, okay, we understand you're elevating the bookkeeping misdemeanor to a felony. What is the underlying felony? And he said, the statute requires me to tell you that we are upgrading, or the statute enables me to upgrade the misdemeanor to a felony. The statute doesn't require me to disclose what the felony is. Well, that's nonsense on the face of it. You could then charge every misdemeanor as a felony and just say, well, we're not going to tell you what the underlying felony is. I mean, you could charge somebody with felony jaywalking. I mean, it doesn't. There's no limiting principle there. So that's obviously not going to stand up on appeal. Furthermore, the judge overseeing that trial instructed the jury that they didn't have to agree on what the underlying felony was.
That's right, because they were all like, and they didn't have to have a full jury, right? It was like only so many were supposed to vote.
No, he had a full jury, but the jury.
No, but
was
you didn't need the full unanimous,
right? In order to get a conviction on an elevated misdemeanor, as we're describing, you have to agree on what the underlying felony is. That's already settled law. The judge told the jury explicitly they did not have to agree. So you might have 3 people say he committed one felony, 3 people think he committed another felony, 3 people think it was a different felony, and I mean you could have 4 different beliefs of a felony, but they don't believe he committed any of the felonies that the other people believe that he committed, and they could still convict, which you can't. That is not what the law says. That is not how the law has been interpreted in the past or how it's written. So that's going to get thrown out. There's nothing to that. So yeah.
And they, like I said, I know it was more political, but even people were like, why did you even do it? You know, like, it's for politics.
Oh, and they tried to milk it for all those words. I mean, look, how many times have they said, well, Donald Trump's a convicted felon, or I can't believe America elected a convicted felon. Yeah. I will say, I was in my office one day, and our IT guy came in. And I don't know how we got to talking about politics, because I don't usually bring it up at the office, but this is Donald Trump we're talking about. He has a tendency to show up in conversation. And he said something like, boy, I would really love to vote for Donald Trump. I just don't know how you can vote for somebody who committed felonies. And so I just asked him, what was the felony? Well, it was like a bookkeeping thing or something. Well, that was a misdemeanor. What was his felony? I don't know. And I just went through basically everything I went through with you right now, and he was like, well, I'm going to go vote for Donald Trump then.
Like it's like mind's aside, like, okay.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. People either saw through it, or they were confused by it, and as soon as they started to learn about it, it's just similar to the Very Fine People hoax. As soon as people learned what actually happened, they were like, oh, well, this is ridiculous. And so you were really just left with the people who were clearly cynically using this for political gain. And
well, the worst of it is that they go, we're charging you 36, but you're not going to do any time.
That was so
that was what was it? That was like was that this month or was that November?
No, that was after the election, because Trump.
It was right after, right?
Well, no, it wasn't that long ago.
I thought it was like a week or two ago.
Yeah,
they we're gonna convict.
Yeah, so they were going to sentence. He was convicted. So what's the sentence going to be? And because they could have sent him to jail and he would have been president in jail. And the judge said, well, I don't remember the legal term, but basically it's. You've been convicted, and then you're free to go.
Which is not how the law works.
Well, no, I mean, it's so wild. It's just pathetic.
That's a wild, like, you're guilty. You go and you go now. You go home now.
Yeah.
I hope you learned your lesson.
The process was the punishment.
It was.
So that's,
that was enough.
So, but
hope you learned your lesson.
Trump's going to appeal. It's going to be thrown out. This is it.
Yeah. And like I said, it's always fun to discuss that, but it is just a wild. It's wild, and all that. But I thought even the DA, who was it? Was it the AG? Because even they're no friends of. They're no friends.
I don't remember if the New York District Attorney. The New York Attorney General said something.
I think he was like, you can't do this. Like this isn't a good idea. And the DA was like, no, we're going to do it. And he's like, good luck. Yeah. And when does that go into appeal? I mean, he's the president now, so I imagine it's like, I don't know the process again, so I don't know. But I mean, like, you just like walk up to the Supreme Court and be like, "Yo, let's get this out of the way."
Well, it would start with I believe the New York Court of Appeals.
Okay,
and then
they did do some. I thought didn't they go through a little bit?
Remember, he also had the real estate case where
that's right.
He sold a building, or he took out a loan on a building and paid the loan back, and then I think that was I forget, it was the different district attorney. New York City has different districts because it's so big. It was it was a different New York City. Oh, what was her name? It was the one who had the really funny name. Letitia.
I thought she was
Letitia Brooks, I think.
James
was her name.
So James.
I thought
that was Georgia though. I thought that was down in Georgia.
No, Georgia was
Fannie Willis.
Fannie Willis.
Okay.
Yeah. And so is it Letitia James?
You're right. I think it is.
Letitia, I'm sorry, I don't remember your last name if you hear this.
She's a big fan of the podcast.
She's tuning in right now.
She's like, oh, there's a new one. I thought it was going to be great.
But she, so she brought the case about the real estate where Trump took out a loan against a building and paid it back. And the bank that provided him the loan was totally satisfied with the way everything happened. And she sued. And that one, I believe, and he lost, but that was where he had to come up with the bond immediately.
That's right.
Which he did come up with the bond, and
Yeah.
then that was appealed. And I don't know if the appeal has been ruled yet or not. But that was where just the appeals court was just grilling the attorney with, like, what is this even supposed to be? Like, there's no accusation of fraud from any party involved.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's I think when people talk about the lawfare aspect of things, it's like, and like, I know some people are like, well, what do you care? It's Donald Trump. It's like, well, yeah, but do you understand if they can do that to him, who do you think they go after? And then, like, again, a timely topic that, we are now one day after, it's Tuesday.
Right.
So go on live tomorrow. But like the J6 protesters,
I was just going to say
the riot, like, look, I remember when it happened, I'm like, these idiots, like, I'm not by no means where I was like, I'm glad they did it. But once you dive into January 6th, you're like, okay, bunch of idiots, they were rioting. But there's also a point when if you watch the footage, you're like, why did they let them in? Like, why is this it starts getting really weird and conspiracy, but at the same point, you're like, there are a video of them just like casually walking around. If
thinking Ray Epps is suspicious makes me a conspiracy theorist, then buy me a tinfoil hat. Clearly.
It gets really weird because at some point you're like, why? Because it was rowdy. It was rowdy. Let's say it's not. It was rowdy.
Yeah.
And people forget too, there was an Air Force veteran. She was shot and killed.
The only person who died that day was an unarmed Air Force veteran.
Yeah. And so, was it dumb? 100%. I think it was stupid. If you want to protest, but which everyone felt that way. But in the same moment, it's not as crazy as what people wanted it out to be. Well, but also,
remember when communists bombed the Capitol building in 1983?
No.
And Bill Clinton pardoned them?
Oh yeah,
when he became
I've
president.
Heard about that. Yes, yeah.
Right, like,
yeah.
So. Just to be clear, that is the double standard. You can literally blow up the Capitol building, and Democrats are cool with it.
Yeah.
But if you go on the other side of a velvet rope, they're going to throw the book at you and try to lock you up for 25 years. Mm-hmm. So,
and again, I think that's what people don't quite understand with the J6 protesters and the riot. It's like
if I could say,
like if you can't lock people up for 25 years for like walking in, there wasn't even like they broke the window and they fucking stormed it. It was like the door is open and they walked in. And then, and again, there's some hallways it was getting rowdy. It was definitely rowdy. But then there's other hallways that like the security was like escort. The guy
when the security's showing you around.
The guy with the what they call him, the Viking.
The shaman.
Shaman.
Yeah.
And he's just walking around and they're like, check this out. Which is, by the way, conspiratorial because you're like, okay, so aren't the cops, why would they not escort him out? Like, why? Right. Why is there 4 cops? It's not like that he outnumbered them. There was him and like 4 cops. And you're like, this is weird. Like, why are you letting people just roam? And like some people really like said that it was funny. They stormed the Capitol, but then they stayed within the velvet ropes.
Within the ropes.
Within the ropes, they were very nice. Like everyone was spaced out. So that's what I mean. It's not like the 2020 riots in Minneapolis that literally burned down blocks.
Right. I think 20 people died in not just in Minneapolis, but in the riots that took place across the country.
And exactly. And like even my buddies that are police during that whole time, they're like, it was a miracle none of us were killed. Yeah. It's like we were getting shot at. Which again, no one reports.
I stayed with you for 3 days because my neighborhood was on fire.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like people were. He's like, it was insane.
I called the police at one point.
Yeah.
And because there was a mob coming towards my address, and when I called the police, the dispatcher's response was, "What do you expect us to do? You're on your own." So if you want a instant conversion to a 2A advocate, I think you just found a way to make it. Yeah.
No, I agree, and I think and I had other family and friends that showed up too at my house.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so. I think that spooked people. I mean, probably not enough. I mean, you had the election after that, but I think that did open up a lot of people's eyes. Like, you had COVID and that kind of come together, which by the way, that was a crazy time. And it's one of those things that get buried in history.
Yeah.
Or the details, like again, cops were getting shot at. No one reported it. We were informed that there was an IED that went off that went off and actually hit a state trooper, like a trooper's car. No one talks about it. The guys on the ground, my buddy Greaves and all them that were infantry that were rolling around, the ATF showed them to go, there's a vehicle bomb, a suicide vehicle bomb, VBID. We have intel that's in the area, so just keep an eye out. And these guys are like, are you serious right now? And they just like left.
Yeah.
And so, and same with us though. I mean, like it was a very weird time because by that time that it got to us, like when I was called up, which was a few days after, my buddies got called before, and then I was like the last of the reserves, and they're like, okay, we're putting a stop to this. We had rules of engagement, like brief, and I raised my hand. I was like, so what's the rules of engagement? He goes, if you feel bodily harm, you are cleared to engage.
Yeah.
And we were given live ammunition, which is a crazy, shocking, surreal, being like, I haven't got that role of engagement since Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So, which is crazy. And no one's really talked about that, where it was like, it got so bad that, and everyone was, there was nobody in there that was like, oh my God, like, oh, that's crazy. Like, everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's like they're gone. And then people were getting shot at. They're finding weapons caches. Again, no one talks about the weapons caches that were planted in between so in Minneapolis, for people listening, there's these little tiny, like almost one-way streets that are in between each house, basically. So you can get into the access of your garage, which is behind your house. So like front of your house has a sidewalk in the main street, and then you kind of go through a side street to then get, So the side streets, there are guys and this isn't like, this is firsthand knowledge. I was next to a guy, he goes, my wife found a milk crate with basically weapons.
Yeah.
Like it was Molotov cocktails.
That was what I actually found. And I called the police to report it.
Yeah.
And that was when they told me you're on your own.
Yeah. People were planning weapons caches. Like and no one talks about that. Like that was a real thing. We're not even making it up. That's not like hearsay. That's not something I saw on social media. That's what happened. Like these are all real things from people that we knew that they 100% there. It's like one separation.
And can I rewind a couple of months before that too? Like obviously we were under lockdowns. Mm-hmm. We had a curfew during the Floyd riots, but we were under lockdowns where it was like you couldn't go to work, businesses were shut down, you couldn't and I remember because this is COVID, when COVID first broke out, and people, I remember seeing people post stuff, just insane paranoid stuff about I saw a car with out-of-state plates. Why is a car with out-of-state plates here if we're under COVID like lockdowns? Like why would they drive to Minnesota? And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe they, maybe they moved here 6 months ago and they haven't updated their license plates. I mean, like maybe they're just passing, like there's reasons people would be here. And then as the riots were going on, I remember seeing like one person said, I just saw 6 Klansmen. They posted this on Facebook. I just saw 6 Klansmen drive by in a pickup truck. I'm thinking, what are you talking about? What, are they wearing hoods and robes just driving around Minneapolis? No, they're not.
Yeah.
And I remember there was there was just widespread paranoia.
Yeah.
That whole year about everything.
Yeah.
The virus and then the riots and everybody was a white supremacist.
Yeah.
It was an insane year to live through.
Yeah.
So
and I don't think people quite understand that. If you don't live through it, like,
or even if you lived in a rural area or something like that, like, or in our city that didn't destroy itself, you probably don't have as full an appreciation as those of us who were stuck in it.
Well, so I went up to Alaska in June, and it was funny. I went up there, and they literally told me, they go, yeah, so what's going on down there in the lower 48? Like COVID wasn't, unless you went through the airport. Airport was the only part that like had a COVID thing going on. Beyond that, it was everyone up in Alaska was like, yeah, whatever. Like it was crazy, and everyone. But it's funny though, because they're literally 20 minutes apart from each other. Like people just live that way,
right? Yeah,
that doesn't, unless you're in.
There's nobody there.
Even if you're in Fairbanks, it's not like you're like on top of each other. People are, I guess I'll just get my supplies like I usually do, and don't see people for 10 days at a time. But that's how life is up there. But no, that was wild. I mean, those were different times. It'll be fun to explain to the kids, because it's like people think back on it. I was like, honestly, the first 2 weeks were like really fun, and then even, we didn't
that
quite
was the
know.
Pleasure Island phase.
Yeah, it was.
Before we all turned into jackasses.
Exactly. It was like, man, I remember me and Amanda, we just bought the house, and we were like getting wine drunk like every night. And then we'd get up and we'd be like, we can't start drinking until like, we give ourselves like till noon. It was like, we can't, cause it'd be like, oh, wait, pandemic, 10 a.m., 11. Okay. We're like, okay, we can't break open the wine, and we switched to box wine because we could, like, we were spending so much money on like bottle wine. We switched to box, and so it's just, and I was working out, running, because they're like, hey, you guys, I was gaining weight because I was drinking so many sugar and carbs through. It was nuts. I'm like, why am I not improving? I was running like 5 miles a day. And I'm like, just because I'm like, the calorie intake of booze was like through the roof, and then we just have like, oh, it's fun, we'll have mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, and then we're gonna watch
literally everything on Disney Plus.
Yeah, it was Tiger King. It had just come out, like not the ultimate. It was Love Is Blind, like just fun shows.
The only thing you didn't watch was Quibi.
What's that?
You don't remember Quibi?
Oh,
that was the streaming service that launched like, I don't know. I think it launched right before COVID hit.
Oh,
and it was a new streaming service, and everything on it was, I think, capped at like 12 minutes or something like that. And so it was like, it was just a failed streaming service. It went out of business right away. It was. It was one of those things. Venture capitalists had poured,
really?
tens of millions of dollars into this thing, and it just immediately
tanked.
Flopped.
The worst part too is it's like COVID, so people are stuck at home.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, because
still failed.
Their argument, Quibi's explanation was, well, we were supposed to be something that people would watch on mass transit. So like everything was like 12 minutes. So it's like you can watch like one, maybe 2 episodes of a show on your way to your destination.
Specific.
That was really specific. Also,
like on the train in New York. Like,
who cares if the episodes are 12 minutes if I'm stuck at home? Like, okay, I'll just watch all of them. Like why would that inhibit people watching this? So, and they edited, like they bought the rights to like major shows like The Office, and then edited them down to like 8-minute episodes.
What?
And then they had that. Yeah, they did a movie that was in 12-minute. I might be wrong about 12 minutes. Maybe it was 10. Maybe it was 15. I'm saying it was like something like that. Starring Liam Hemsworth, I think. That was based on was it The Island? The one where the guy, or no, The Most Dangerous Game.
Oh, okay.
And so they
was it good?
I don't know. I didn't watch it. It was Quibi, man. Nobody was watching it.
No one was watching Quibi.
So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Oh, and it had another thing because it was designed to go on your phone. So if you held it horizontally, you would get one camera angle. Yeah. And if you turned it vertically, it would be like a whole different like camera angle of the scene. So
it's way too much thought.
Just a lot of novelty.
That is a good idea, Fairy. They're like, oh my God, it's going to take. It's like when people do that and they go, it's going to take off.
Yeah.
It's going to be vertical and horizontal. You know? Yeah. And then Via's like a filmmaker, just a guy that's like freelancer, be like, you're right. And it's going to cost you this amount of money.
Right, yeah.
But we're going to do it that way, and I believe in your mission. I believe in your project, just as long as those checks clear.
If you're looking for a director, I recommend Tommy Wiseau. Because he loves doing 2 cameras at once.
Two cameras at once, both film and digital. No, yeah, that's awesome. That makes me laugh. Anyways, I don't even know how we got them that way.
We were talking about COVID, so yeah.
But prior to that, I'm sorry, so anyways, now we are at 2025. Greenland. Jump into that. Total mood shift.
Yeah, all right. Let's talk Greenland.
Yeah. Strategically, how does it... Hawaii was the last state, correct? Or Hawaii, 1954 or something like that.
Yeah. Was it 54? It's close enough, anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, that we probably would not make Greenland a state.
No.
Let's keep in mind we have other, like Puerto Rico has a lot more people in it than Greenland, and Puerto Rico's not a state.
Yeah.
Guam isn't a state. Mm-hmm. The Northern Mariana Islands aren't a state. Yeah. And certainly, Baker Island is not a state, but they have a population of 0, so that would. Mm-hmm. But Greenland has about 50,000 people, and they have natural resources, and they're strategically located between us and Russia. And so there's been conversation dating back to the 1800s on whether or not the United States should acquire Greenland. Mm-hmm.
Which is funny that everyone's talking about it now, but it's if you're a history buff,
it's actually come and gone as a point of discussion several times.
I mean, that's funny because like you said, it's like one of those things where no one talks about it until it becomes a thing. And
Trump even talked about it like 6 or 7 years ago in his first term. He talked about it and people mocked him.
Yeah.
But it's been a regular point off and on in conversation. This kind of returns us to what we had started off with, like the different types of conservatism, where most people, whether you're Democrats or Republicans these days, have a very conservative attitude of like, well, we just don't want things to change. Mm-hmm. And I really recommend, if you haven't watched it, watch the first 10 minutes of Marco Rubio's confirmation hearing. Okay. You don't have to watch the whole 4 or 5 hours or whatever it is, but his opening remarks is like a 10-minute speech he gives. Yeah. And he really explains the change that needs to take place in U.S. foreign policy, basically in these terms of like, he doesn't say we need to abandon the conservative mindset because that would be too politically loaded. But he says that the end of history model that we've been operating under is wrong and we need to get away from that. And so when we talk about Greenland, for the basically since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has had the mentality that we've reached the end of history. There is no more conflict. Borders are all settled. We're just going to be in this status quo position where the United States is at the top of the food pyramid and top of the food chain, and everybody else is sort of happy with where they're at. Well, obviously the Chinese aren't happy with that. Mm-hmm. Obviously the Russians aren't happy with that. The Indians aren't happy with that. Like other countries are not satisfied. Mm-hmm. Europe's given up all hope of ever achieving anything. Clearly they've just given up. Mm-hmm. But most countries haven't, and we've become complacent. And so when I look at Greenland, my concerns are this. I'm less concerned about Russia than I am a Greenland alignment towards China. So the threat there is really, whether it be Russia or China, that Greenland, which is currently led by a socialist prime minister who is also the leader of the Independence Party. They want Greenland's independence. If he is able to get more support from Russia and or China, that creates the potential of an independent Greenland aligned with adversaries of the United States. And especially when it comes to China. I think China's looking at our playbook from the Cold War. What was the U.S. strategy during the Cold War? Containment. The idea was we would keep the communist countries contained, we would prevent the spread of communism into other surrounding countries, and eventually we managed to triangulate relations with China and Russia so we could play Russia and China off each other, thus splitting the two primary communist countries. Ultimately, the Soviet Union fell apart, and China adopted, started to adopt sort of economic reforms, and then they pulled back on that, and we don't need to get into all of that right now. The point is, I think China is looking at, well, how successful the U.S. was in destroying the Soviet Union. And I don't think it's a coincidence that China's Belt and Road Initiative has really surrounded Europe and started to infiltrate Europe. I don't think it's a coincidence that China is taking over the Panama Canal. And I don't think that it's a good idea to allow the Chinese to be more supportive of an independent Greenland movement than we are. Mm-hmm. So what I would like to see is the United States find a way to cooperate with the government of Greenland to pursue our mutual interests, regardless of Denmark's opinion on it. So, yeah.
And so what is, do you know much about the Greenland, not the economy, but the politics of it? Like, do they want to be independent? Do they want to be part of Denmark? Do they,
No, they have a very healthy independence movement. They don't want to be a part of, and which, also kind of echoes Panama, 120 years ago or 140 years ago when we supported the Panamanian rebels against the Nicaraguans to gain their own independence. And so Denmark overwhelmingly wants independence. Maybe I shouldn't say overwhelmingly, I don't know. But it's the most popular parties in Denmark are the independence parties. So most people in Denmark want most people in Greenland want independence from Denmark, and you can understand why. I mean, it's
because they don't want to be they don't want to be like, well, we don't want to get bought up either by the U.S. Like they want to be their own country.
Yeah,
yeah,
and there's going to be very different interests between the Danish and Greenlanders, and just by nature of environment and distance.
But I mean, you think about that; it's pretty advantageous though too. Because here's the thing: there's also that sentiment down in Puerto Rico. Like Puerto Ricans are their own, they aren't, it's weird because they're a U.S. territory.
Right.
They are their own country per se to a certain extent, but like socially, like when people are like, oh, I'm from Puerto Rico, like you still think Puerto Rico's like its own country.
Well, they're U.S. citizens.
But they're U.S. citizens and they're U.S. territory. They have a lot of the benefits.
So they are part of our country, but they're not they're not a state.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I'm saying is there's a lot of benefits to that and almost more than cons, honestly. Like that's the best place to be. Like, you still get to have your own elections. You still but you get all the benefits of the federal government coming in. You got good roads. You got everything's well maintained. And
a lot of garbage though. They haven't quite figured that one out.
True. Yeah. But
you know what? If we can annex Greenland, we can send all the trash there. Yeah. They got the space for it.
They got But that's what I'm saying is I think Puerto Rico. You kind of think that they're divided, because there's not a movement there, but there's always this sentiment of we should be our own country. Yeah. But the life is so good now that they, because my brother-in-law is Puerto Rican, or his dad is from Puerto Rico, and so it's very much because I asked him about that. I was like, so what do they think? What do Puerto Ricans think? He's like, well, it's basically kind of like a double-edged sword. They're they want their independence, but if you do that now, it's chaos, and and it's look at every other Central American country. You want to go to that? Even the good ones.
I want to go to Argentina at this point. Yeah. I'd take Javier Milei over.
Oh yeah, that's true. But I'm saying is, but even then though, you have the security of the United States, you have all the benefits, and now take all that away, and then you guys are an island nation. So how many factions are you going to split up to? And it's going to cause chaos. There's going to be bloodshed. There's going to be revolution. There's going to be a civil war most likely because people are going to fight over who's going to be in power. Like it's not a peaceful transition to be like, all right, well, everything's good. We're just going to accept our,
I've talked to at national conventions of national political conventions. I've talked to the Puerto Rican delegates who attend sometimes, and I've asked them, so what is politics like in Puerto Rico? Because they still have the Democrat and Republican parties
they do.
in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
But he said that basically the issue that everything organizes around is statehood versus independence. Like that is what people are thinking in terms of. It's the major dividing issue of people. Probably similar to the way abortion is. In the rest of the United States, where it's like, we talk about taxes and we talk about tariffs and we talk about foreign intervention, but really, if you drill most people down to it, you probably 80 to 90% of people pick their political party based on their stance on life, whether they want to admit it or not. So
that's what I'm saying. I think Greenland. That's a pretty nice offer. Even in the independent Greenlands, you'd be like, look, become a U.S. territory. We're not commies. We're not Chinese.
Well, that's the problem. Greenland are though.
What's that? Are they commies?
Greenland are very far left.
Oh, okay.
So that which is another reason why I think we should probably be more concerned about Chinese cooperation with Greenlanders than Russians. Okay. I have no direct knowledge of Chinese courting that relationship, but it seems to me that that's the most natural philosophical alignment. Yeah. And again, looking at China really forming the relationships to surround the United States and cut us off from other allies, it's a natural move. So yeah.
All right, so we take Greenland then.
Yeah, well, that was something that was so funny in the Pete Hegseth hearing when Mazie Hirono asked him, "Would you, if the president ordered you to invade Greenland, would you do it?" And Pete Hegseth started answering, "Well, he was elected by 74 million Americans," and she said, "Well, I don't care who was elected or what. I want to know if you would do." And I'm like, you don't care who was elected? That's the whole point of the election, is how we determine who our leaders are. So will you want the president to order an invasion of a foreign country and his own Secretary of Defense just says no? I mean, don't you want democratic accountability? I thought that's what the January 6th was so bad about, was that it was going to be the end of democracy. So
that's pretty wild, though. So then they're much more warm to China, but or are you saying?
I don't know. I'm just saying ideologically they're more aligned with China than with the United States. So
there's not many of them. It's like 50-some thousand.
It's like 50,000 or something.
Yeah. Which is, like I said, I think when people talk about they're like, oh, Iceland, but they're much more socialist, but also their natural location also makes them be able to be socialist. When they're like, oh yeah, well, we have unlimited volcanic energy that we don't charge for anything for heat. I'm like, well, we all don't live under volcanoes, right? On top of volcanoes. Minnesota's not on top of a volcano. Therefore, we have to pay
limited
for
geothermal opportunities.
Exactly. It means we have to pay for things, which means capitalism, which means, and so I think when Iceland's like that and they're small and they're like, well, we don't need much. Well, it's like, because we would conquer you in a day.
And think about that. Think about that too with Greenland, is if we decided to invade, or if any country decided to invade, what would they do to stop them? Yeah. I mean, you've got 50,000 people. I mean, you're not going to be able to stand up to... Sweden could probably take you over if they wanted to. There's nothing you could do to resist. Yeah. It's funny. The amount of outrage over those comments, both about Greenland and about Panama. Yeah. And I was listening to one commentator who said, I can't believe Trump would say this. It's like, he doesn't, I lived through the Cold War. Doesn't he know that, you can't just talk about overthrowing allied governments? We literally invaded Panama in 1989. It has precedent during the Cold War.
Yeah. I agree. Now, not only Panama, it was Grenada.
And Grenada.
Yeah. Very short wars.
Yeah.
2 weeks, but still very significant. Yeah. No, I agree.
And Noriega had been a U.S. ally before we removed him. Yeah. And we put him in, I think, a prison in Florida where he eventually died. Yeah. I don't know. It's this sort of I'm not the one who forgot the Cold War, okay?
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm saying I think it would be dope to have them as a U.S. territory. I think that's a win-win for everybody. Yeah. Even if they are more socialist or whatever, be like, all right, man, fine, whatever.
Yeah, but
you're U.S. territory, and I don't know, let's give everybody a bunch of money when we buy it.
What we need to do is recognize that we are in a second Cold War right now. And
No,
we
I
need to
agree.
have-
Well, that's the thing like with Afghanistan, people don't, and this is a bit of a deep dive, but because we had so many contacts on the ground during the evacuation.
Oh, yeah.
So as soon as it was over, quote unquote, on September 11th, September 12th and 13th, because the families we couldn't get out, we were all texting them. And they were like, and one guy just straight took, he goes, hey, China, like literally a plane came into Bagram, the military base, and a bunch of Chinese nationals came off it.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, China is trying to do the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Afghanistan's, they touch China, but it's also, there's a whole, this geography and all sorts of stuff. And they might exploit it. They might be able to, but it's also, you have about like 20 different terrorist groups there and still pretty dangerous, even for the Chinese to try to maneuver.
Oh,
they'll try, but it's like the
Have you ever
cost of
seen
getting things out to the tribes you have to pay off to that tribe one, but this one's going to come out of nowhere and blow everyone up.
Well,
So
and
it's
even
kind of
when we
a tough-
say like the Taliban is running Afghanistan now,
They're not.
like nobody's. I mean, there's a plot of land controlled by the Taliban in an area that we call Afghanistan. Like I mean, it's not like the entirety of what we call Afghanistan is run by the Taliban. There's obviously sectionalism, factions.
the tribes, everything.
Yeah.
And then other extremist groups that come in, they're just that crazy or even crazier. That Taliban, it's like a whole mishmash. It's nuts, the whole thing. But yeah, and I think, but when you talk about our adversaries,
did you ever see the documentary Empire of Dust? Okay, I really recommend looking it up. It's about what country is it in? It's an African country. I think they speak French. I'm trying to remember.
Mali?
I don't remember which country it was. But the French, I mean, they speak French in a lot of Africa. But it's about a Chinese contractor who's basically like a middle manager who's sent there to work on this construction project and oversee this construction project. And he just is at his wit's end. He doesn't know how to get the African workers to work. Like he just like, and equipment's always going missing. Everything's always breaking. People will just disappear for days at a time.
Yeah.
And he's just, there's a famous scene where he just stares off into the distance and just says, it's all so tiresome. Like he just doesn't know how to do this.
Yeah.
And there's also a great scene in there where he just rails the local who's his translator.
Yeah.
And he says, why don't you like, the French were here or the British were here, or whoever was here at that time, and they built you roads and they built you telephone systems or telegraph lines and they built you a railroad and they built all of this stuff. All you had to do was maintain it. All you had, like they gave it to you. And he says, well, we've only been independent for 60 years. And the Chinese guy's like, 60 years ago, we had a famine in China. Like, like we had nothing. Like, how have you not been able to just maintain what they gave you? And it's when I the white pill of the sort of global Chinese empire that we're seeing take shape is like, well, whether it be Afghanistan or Africa, like these areas aren't just like, well, you can just go in there and take it over. It's not like we were just too nice and the Chinese will just be more harsh and take it over. It's like, no, these are complicated cultures that do not necessarily respond to anybody coming in.
And they move on their own time. And it's like, it's just like, whatever. It's like the corruption. It's like you almost have to bring in your own people to do anything anyways. I think that's why they brought the Chinese nationals in. Now, I haven't heard, that's been 3 years ago now, so I don't know what the progress is on the ground. But like, you would think you would hear some sort of intelligence like China's doing great in Afghanistan. They're not. Because there's nothing coming out, which means like, no news at this point. It's like typically no news is good news. No news is bad news. Like, they're like, oh man, like nothing's getting moved, and all it takes is, honestly, now Trump's day 2, Trump's in office. Don't think that we're not planning something for Afghanistan.
Sure.
Don't think that Pete Hegseth has some sort of trick up their sleeve that, not saying we're reinvading, but don't think that there might be some drones might be dropping something here and there in support of the Northern Alliance or the Northern NRF or whatever. To do something, or even just let's just drop some bombs on some of these convoys. That's Taliban. That's Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda's there. ISIS is there. Maybe which target we hit, we don't know. So I think that's that. Again, the Chinese have to deal with that now. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like we could easily like wipe out their whole all the stuff that just mined out, we could wipe out the whole convoy and be like, well, that was an Al Qaeda ISIS. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's like,
We'll to be cynical about it. We would look at it and be like, all right, you know what? As long as ISIS is fighting the Chinese, we'll send them some rocket launchers.
Yeah.
Like we don't like.
just
we
like,
back the Mujahideen. I mean, it's not.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it was McCain that was he was basically arming Al Qaeda to fight ISIS. And you're like, you realize that we were fighting these guys. You know, like even some special operations guys, like SF guys, were like, we're not doing this. Like,
But remember the old Washington quote: "America should have no allies, only interests."
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, all right,
yeah.
if this is.
Oh
if
yeah,
this
well
is
that's how But I think it's a little personal when you're on the ground and you're training the
sure.
people that are now trying to kill you, or the people that were trying to kill you you're now training. You know, and they're like, well, they're just going to turn on us in a second. Like, I think it's a little more personal when you're at my level. It's a lot more personal than
which is
the general's level.
When you think about it, when you look back on, say, the history of either the Civil War, the fact that we were able to come together again.
Which is wild.
When you had people who were literally trying to, people who went to school together, literally went to West Point together, or were even, in-laws, finding themselves on opposite sides of these battles, and then, coming together again at the end of that.
Like, how was that? That was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and then having reunions where they would have at Gettysburg, where you would have both the Confederate Army and the Union Army soldiers who survived show up, every 10 years or whatever until there were none left, and they'd shake hands, and like, what an amazing thing we were able to accomplish there. Or even like Operation Paperclip. Yeah. Where we bring all these Nazi scientists to the United States to work on our missile program.
Which I think...
And Jewish Americans did not riot in the streets. They were like, all right, I guess we got to beat the Soviets.
Yeah. Which is a wild... It's like, and I think that's a bit more exposed now too. I mean, like, I think all the way up to now, all the information's out there. Like,
everybody knew Werner von Braun. I mean, that wasn't a secret even at the time.
But even when you start getting older, now the information's much more easily accessible. Where a lot of people didn't know because you just kind of learn about it in school.
Everybody knew Werner von Braun in the 60s. He was a running joke.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Bob Newhart did a whole routine about it.
Oh okay. Well, maybe it's our generation. Like my parents didn't know. I didn't know. Like the next generation didn't know.
Yeah, we definitely were not taught that.
We're not taught that, which is like fine, whatever. Man, like, at the end of the day, we still won the space race. So it's like, but you start learning, like, ooh, man, but history is messy.
Yeah.
Wars, and you're right. Like, and it is a weird thing on how much we hated. It's like the enemy of my enemy. So we teamed up, but we weren't happy teaming up with Soviets, and then it's like, and now it's like immediately turned to, hey, Soviets are the enemy, communism the enemy, all right, we defeated the Nazis, but now we got to, pivot.
Yeah.
So it is kind of wild to, like you said, not seeing obviously eye with the Soviets, but you're like, all right, we got to defeat these Nazis.
So that's an interesting thing to bring up, which is sort of the defeating the Nazis in Europe and the Soviets, because remember, of course, it started off with the Soviets and the Nazis having the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where they were going to work together, and
which is wild to think of, because it was like and again, Hitler. Everyone's like, well, if he wanted to turn his back on the Soviets, it's a whole different world.
Who knows? Yeah. But it's been really interesting to me these last several years. I've sort of engaged in a study of fascism.
Yeah.
And we throw that term around, but people don't really look at what it means or where it came from. Nowadays, we just use it to dismiss any idea that we don't like.
Yeah.
But it's actually a lot of people will say, well, fascism, was it left wing or was it right wing? Mm-hmm. And to me, that's really missing the point.
Because they want to put it in context of modern terms,
right?
Which is different than what
left wing and right wing have really broken down since those are terms that originated, in like the French Revolution to describe pro-monarchical versus Republican perspectives. Like, we're so far from that they're really not useful. And so as I was reading about fascism, and people talk about, well, fascism is socialism, but it's right-wing socialism, but it's just like, so let me try and like to give you my 2 cents as a guy who spent, tens of hours reading actual fascist writings.
Yeah.
So there was a thinker in Germany named Hegel, philosopher, who came up with this idea, or articulated this. He didn't come up with it, I guess, but articulated basically a general philosophy that said science, what he called science, the gain of knowledge, is when you have the status quo, which he called the thesis, get confronted with something new, the antithesis, and they reconcile, and you are left with a new synthesis. So it's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And this is how knowledge is acquired. And I don't think you can overstate Hegel's influence on German thought. Basically, if I was going to try and find a parallel in, say, our more Anglo way of thinking, it would be like Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
Everything that we think about, we tend to think about in Newtonian terms. Like, how often will you hear somebody say something like, well, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Yeah. When they're not talking about physics, they're talking about like, my brother-in-law got drunk and crashed into a post, but every action has a reaction or something. I mean, we use that as almost like a colloquialism. Or we talk about an object at rest tends to stay at rest. It permeates our way of thinking, and we use these or mutations of them as sort of metaphors that we understand everything through. And Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis had that same kind of impact on German thought about everything, where it was you frame everything in these terms. The most famous Hegelian was Karl Marx. And when we talk about Marxism, we tend to focus on a sort of superficial quality of, well, that's when the government runs all the businesses or something like that, which is not at all close. That's sort of the de facto what happened. But what Marx proposed was an inevitable trajectory of history. Basically, think of Marx more as a prophet than as a philosopher, or an economist, certainly, in which he believed that he had possessed the sacred knowledge of the ultimate synthesis. And so his goal was to kind of teach people how to think through. And once you had achieved significant conscientization, that is, you were conscious of this relationship, then we'd sort of all be locked into like a natural pattern of the way the cells, the organelles in your cell aren't conscious, but they all kind of do whatever needs to be done to keep the cell working. And that's sort of what would happen. We'd have this sort of homeostatic, perfect, everybody cooperating in exactly the same way. You wouldn't have to be forced to do something. Because you would just know intuitively, I need to do this, I need to do that. You wouldn't even think about it. It'd be like a reflex. So that's a bit of a deeper understanding of what Marxism is than kind of how it was presented to me. But when I was young, after you start reading it and learning about this stuff, and so Marx's compatriot Engels, he wrote a very useful tract called Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, in which he describes, again, I'm using scientific in this thesis, synthesis, antithesis, or a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's hard to say that three times, right? Kind of way, in which, so he's describing that, and he says, well, the reason every other form of socialism has failed, this is like in the 1870s he's writing this, yes, socialism has always failed, but that's because they didn't have real socialism. They didn't have the
common quote,
the scientific socialism that we have today. So once this is implemented, it'll work. And Lenin, of course, then brings his perspective on that. Stalin brings his perspective on that. We see the Soviet Union rise. The socialists, these Hegelians who did not... there were Hegelians who had this sort of Marxist perspective, men like Benito Mussolini or Giovanni Gentile, who basically grew frustrated. And they looked at, outside of the Soviet Union, every place where we're trying to have these socialist revolutions, it's not happening. And they concluded that the problem with the Marxists is they're obsessed with theory. They just think if you can get your knowledge of the end of history correct, if you can get your knowledge of the eschaton correct, what that final synthesis is, then everything will fall into place. But the only way to determine, say the fascists, what that ultimate end goal is and how to get there is to constantly test everything. So action, action, action. Action is how we learn. So the Marxists basically take Hegelian eschatology and say we need to perfect our thinking. The fascists take Hegelian eschatology and say we need to just constantly act and see what happens. So anytime you hear a politician say something like, we don't need thoughts and prayers, we need action, they've perfectly articulated the cornerstone of fascist doctrine. Anytime you've heard a politician say we have to pass a law to find out what it does, they've perfectly articulated the idea of fascism. Does that make sense?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
Which is so it's more. I should say it's not as it's not what people traditionally think. Then what you're saying as a fascism.
Imagine you have two people who say it's going to rain tomorrow, and you say, well, how did you determine that? And one guy says, well, I had a barometer and I have a thermometer and I'm looking at the weather reports and the wind directions and I've got Doppler radar set up so I can see where the storm front's coming through and I can say it's going to rain tomorrow. Oh, okay. And then you ask another person, why do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? And they say, well, I cut the head off a chicken and let it run around on this chart and where it finally fell over and died was on the square that said it's going to rain. Okay. You have two very different approaches reaching that same conclusion. You shouldn't look at that conclusion to determine which of those approaches is good. And let me clarify this at this point. I'm not saying either fascism or Marxism is good. I'm just saying don't focus on, well, they both collectivized everything. Yes, but that's not the point that, well, they didn't collectivize quite the same as the way these guys collectivized. That's not the point.
Yeah.
Look at the underlying philosophy that drove those actions. Now, in the case of fascism versus Marxism, it's not so much a weatherman versus some
voodoo.
sort of voodoo. It's voodoo versus voodoo. It's one guy cuts the head off a chicken, another guts a sheep and tries to read the entrails. It's they're everything growing out of that Hegelian way of thinking is trash, including Francis Fukuyama's end of history model that I had referenced earlier that Rubio condemned in his speech, which, by the way, is like this shows you the depth of thought that Marco Rubio has on this, that he's actually thinking through that. So, but I don't want to digress. Does that make sense? Does that metaphor make a little more sense?
How does that get confused with the modern term of fascism when people just think of like Hitler?
Right.
Or
it's
freedom of speech is restricted fascism.
Yeah, and it's where the conversation breaks down when people will say, particularly about economics, they'll say, well, but corporate cooperation with the state is fascism. And so we can't have that. Oh, but defense contractors sell weapons to the state, so defense contractors are fascist. Well, but that's not real fascism because socialism is. It's like, guys, we can talk about the policies that we want to implement, but if you're stuck in this argument over whether fascism is right wing or left wing, or whether fascism is a form of socialism, or yes, fascism is socialism, Marxism is socialism, and there are utopian socialist models out there as well. Think of it. There's three types of socialism.
Yeah.
Utopian, Marxist, and fascist, right? They're all trash, but they all reach socialist conclusions for different reasons, right? There were Christian socialists, utopian socialists who believed in these sort of like, well, we'll start a little convent in the wilderness of America and we'll just share everything, and those always fell apart.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Marxists who said, well, we'll lead a revolution in Russia and we'll force everybody to think correctly. And that obviously fell apart. And then you've got the fascists who said, well, we need to constantly be doing things, which ultimately led to them going to war with everybody and getting beaten. So all three socialist approaches don't work. They fail to account for the actual way human beings behave. They reach those policy prescriptions based on different underlying philosophies, though. So, yeah.
And so, like you said, fascism, that aspect that gets thrown into... Like obviously that everyone's like, oh, Nazism, because they were pushing more. They were seeing the action of that, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why if you've ever wondered, why did the Nazis have death camps and the Soviets had re-education camps? Right? Now, don't get me wrong. The Soviets killed more people in their re-education camps than the Nazis did in the death camps.
Yeah.
But the Nazis didn't care how you thought. They just wanted you dead. Like you could think anything you wanted under the Nazis.
Yeah.
You couldn't say it. And you couldn't live how you wanted to live. You had to be obedient to the state. But you could think. They didn't care how you thought as long as you didn't share your thoughts with anybody and you obeyed them. The Soviets believed that they could create paradise on Earth if they could just break down everyone's thinking and fully conscientize them to the reality. And that's why the Soviets would send you to a work camp. The idea was you'll work in these miserable conditions. It'll totally break your mind. And then we'll be able to reconstruct you as the new Soviet man. And of course, that's not what happened. People just starved to death and froze to death and got shot. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think and so then, like I said, obviously the big debate too, when people talk about, again, it always comes down to the Nazis because that's all we know as a reference, is the Nazis was that the German Socialist Party?
Well,
or
and that's the other thing.
like an argument.
They put socialist right in their name, and it's like.
But then people are like, well, right wingers are Nazis. And you're like, well, this is getting weird because how are you? Because you look at them, you look at obviously the Nazi movement. But I mean, in World War II,
what they'll say is like, well, yes, the National Socialists called themselves socialists, but that wasn't real socialism because they weren't Marxist. No, that's not the point. Marxism is a type of socialism. Yeah. It's not social. It's not a synonym for socialism.
Yeah. So because that's what I'm saying is like they were national. They're obviously big nationalists,
right?
But they were socialist in their policies or whatever you're saying. Like they weren't like, hey man, small government, let's you know, like all that kind of stuff. Like lower the taxes, all that, et cetera. So I think that's kind of that weird. When people start talking, and again, I agree with you. It starts getting weird when you start diving into history, or even when people talk about current day into European politics. When they're like, oh, the right wingers, you're like, well, right wingers here are actually it's like the way they refer to right wingers in some countries, like liberal, and then it's like the left. It's like this whole difference. So when people in the U.S. are like, oh man, those whatever X country is the right wing party, it's like, well, actually, that's
the right wing party is still
liberal, or it's a weird. You have to like almost deep dive, and again, shows the ignorance of. If you're not in that country, if you're not in that culture, you have to understand the politics of it to even start commentating.
I'll give you another example. Australia, literally, the capital L Liberal Party is aligned with the Republican Party of the United States.
Yeah.
Because by liberal they mean free from government. Yeah. So they're the party that wants lower taxes. Yeah. So one of my favorite authors, F.A. Hayek, strong recommend if you haven't read any of his books, pick up some F.A. Hayek. It's all good. He oftentimes uses the term. He actually wrote a book, or not a book, but a pamphlet called "Why I Am Not a Conservative," in which he says, like, well, I don't want to conserve things. I want to change everything. So I guess that would make me a progressive, but like that's a captured ideological term to mean leftist, communist, Marxist, whatever. And I'm not a liberal because. In the United States, the liberals, the Marxists adopted the term liberal, and the socialists adopted the term liberal. So I'm not a liberal. So he's like, I don't know what to call myself, but I'm not a conservative.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think is that where the libertarian.
That's kind of where the libertarians get their name.
Yeah. I mean, like it's and you see a lot of conservatives shift into that direction. Yeah. Like, well, I'm a conservative libertarian, or I'm a libertarian. You're like. Especially when it comes to like nobody wants to have the conservative. I'm a Republican. Like when it comes to like commentators, we're like, wow, I'm a free thinker.
Yeah,
but everything you're talking about is conservative, or I mean, is Republican talking points. But you want to say you're a libertarian to like seem like you're cool. I don't, you know what I mean? Not all of them, or not in every instance, but sometimes it's almost a cover. Like if somebody goes, oh, I'm libertarian, I'm like, okay, cool. So me and you are basically the same. Yeah, like you were 99%.
Unless they're a capital L libertarian, because that party is just like
nuts. That's like which most aren't. If you're like in a normal conversation with somebody and they say they're libertarian, typically they're going to be like, I'm soft Republican. You know, it's in that again. That's where we are currently. And I think too when we talk about I've done this for years actually. Is it's not so much again. We're talking two conservatives talking to each other right now, but when you talk about like say Ben Shapiro when they first started, which I agreed with, and then before I even started listening to that, like years before, there's the difference between liberals and leftists. And I think that does get confused because like some older boomers and whatnot. I mean, my dad, I love him. He says it. It's like, oh, those liberals, like, that doesn't apply anymore. I mean, this isn't 20, 30, 40, 30 years ago. Yeah. Liberals are much more in the conservative Republican Party than say
the kind of Dave Rubin kind of Dave Rubin. You're like, well, I want low taxes, but
even if liberals are in the Democratic Party and they'll vote Democratic, but even if you talk to them individually, most everything they do now skews into.
I knew a guy. I had a boss, and he told me he wanted our company to become an affirmative action company. This guy was a lifelong. Self-professed liberal Democrat. He literally interned at the Watergate building. Yeah. Right? That's how long this guy had been a diehard Democrat. And he said he wants us to be an affirmative action company. And I said, well, that's a big commitment. And he says, no, you just have to have some statement that says we don't have a problem hiring black people. I said, no, that's already illegal. Like
that's already illegal. Yeah.
To become affirmative action means you're going to specifically do things to change the nature of your workforce in terms of race or gender or sexual orientation. I don't remember all the things that accounted for right now. But he said, first he says, really, he thought this was like the pinnacle of what he goes. But Travis, that would mean taking race into consideration when hiring. Yes, that is what it means. That is literally what it means. And he got real curt. And he says, just find the resources online and put it together. Yeah. So I go on, and City of Minneapolis, of course, has resources. They want you to do it. So it's like, oh yeah, here's what you need to do. How much money do you make, or how many employees do you have, or blah blah blah, whatever the requirements are. You plug them into this equation, then it spits out you need this many black people, this many women, whatever. And then you have to put together a plan to achieve that. So you have to say like, well, we're gonna advertise job listings in black newspapers, or we're gonna find women's magazines, and that's what next time we're hiring, we'll post the job in a women's magazine, or these kinds of things. And so I put together a plan, and I bring it to him, and I said, now remember, if we do this isn't like we do this for one job. Like if we do this, we're committed to doing this for 7 years or something like that. Yeah. And he said, yeah, give it to me. So I gave it to him, and about 15 minutes later, he walks back over to my desk and he goes, "This is bullcrap. They can't make us do this." Now, this guy had spent his entire life supporting affirmative action. Yeah. And I'm sure I'm not the first person who said to him what it was. But I guarantee you, he thought, well, that's just a straw man put up by conservatives. That's just, obviously you're not going to take race into consideration by hiring. It was when he was confronted with the reality, though, all of a sudden he realized, there's a difference between what I think of as liberal and what the actual leftists are forcing us to be. So,
yeah. That's how long ago was that?
That was a few years ago. About 10 years ago.
Yeah. That was 10 years ago. Yeah. Well, I guess time's flying now, so never mind. So that was like 2012, 2013. So that's when it starts.
Yeah, 2025. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, 20. That's when it started.
2015. Yeah. That was about. But
things were starting.
But affirmative action has always been that.
No, it's always been
what affirmative action has been, and so it's
not like DEI is now. Like affirmative action was like the old school. Like, and people argue that too. I was like, look, there may be a time and place. Like I understand. It's like when during the debates. With RFK. That was one that I remember some people's hangups because the Supreme Court ruled, hey, affirmative action, we're not doing this anymore. Yeah. And so people were arguing it, and I think RFK wasn't a fan, but it's like, yeah, but you also grew up in the civil rights era. So like I understand why you don't want to see that go away, because that's an achievement within that era.
And remember, there were two phases to the civil rights movement. Yeah. The first phase of the civil rights movement was just saying the government won't discriminate against you based on race. The government can't segregate the schools. Yeah. The government can't it can't require you to pay a poll tax to vote. Yeah. The second half of the civil rights movement, was where it stopped being about civil rights and started being about government coercion of businesses. And that's where it said, oh, you can't discriminate based on race if you run a barbershop. Mm-hmm. Oh, you can't discriminate based on race if you, run a restaurant. Now, I would never discriminate based on race, but let's remember why that part of the civil rights movement took the shape that it did, of trying to have the federal government say, well, we're going to prevent this. And that's not because businesses were discriminating based on race because they wanted to. It's because Jim Crow laws had been passed that forced businesses. The problem was businesses weren't discriminating. So Jim Crow laws were passed that said, on the state level, that said you have to discriminate and have a white counter and a black counter, or only allow the blacks in during certain hours or what have you. Yeah. And then the federal government, instead of saying, well, we're going to ban Jim Crow laws or we're going to pass an amendment that prohibits that or something. Instead, the government said, okay, well, we're going to address the businesses directly. So, yeah.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, you start deep diving into this stuff. You're like, oh, okay. Like you start understanding a bit more. But like I said, even when they did away with it, because you look at our era now, it's, when people are like, yeah, man, like I hate to say it, but we're, no one, I always say this, we all have equal rights, but not everyone is equal, and everyone gets an equal opportunity either. Like, I think that's hard for some people to swallow, especially in our era now. Everything's at everyone's fingertips. Like there isn't a better time to be alive. And they're like, well, people are disadvantaged. It's like, well, everyone is. Like everyone's.
Everybody has some kind of struggle.
Yeah, but they always, and again, this gets kind of weird when you start getting into, it's like, seems like it's going against, when even people brought it up, it's like, it almost, it's this weird thing of privilege, but it then turns into economy and class, which is more of a socialist, communist thing. Where it's like, oh, we don't discriminate by, by race, but now we're going to start targeting, class.
Well, yeah.
Which is, you start getting into this weird territory, because at the face value, it's like, oh, they want to focus on race, when it comes to, DEI or whatever. But then it starts getting into that weird, like, oh no, but if you're rich and black, things start getting, or if you are conservative and rich and black, and then it starts getting really weird.
So that's the thing. So the classical Marxism was based entirely on economics.
Yeah, economics.
Right? And Marx believed that there were phases to history, and they were all based on economics. Yeah. Ultimately, they would reach that eschaton that I talked about. But and that's why if you read the Communist Manifesto, it would probably surprise you to know that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says we're going to support the capitalists. Why? Because he says we're going to support the capitalists in places where they still have an aristocracy. So we'll support the capitalists. The capitalists will overthrow the aristocracy, and then the proletariat will overthrow the capitalists. Right? Because he just believed this was like dominoes. This was just an inescapable path of history. So even Marx was pro-capitalist.
But to a certain extent.
But he just meant it as because he believed capitalism wasn't an idea. He believed capitalism was a class, and so or capitalist was a class, and so we'll overthrow we'll use the capitalists to overthrow the monarchs, and then we'll use the proletariat to overthrow the capitalists. Anyway, that was the classic Marxism focused on the economics. Now, what we've seen now is this rise of what we use the kind of the umbrella term woke to focus on DEI or affirmative action or ESG scores people bring up a lot. And that gets rooted in the postmodernists looking at it and saying, okay, well, there's more dimensions of oppression than commercial. There's more than just the economic component here. And so they started saying, well, everybody exists at a nexus of oppression based on their skin color or their ethnicity or their religion or their immigration status or whatever, just men versus women, or what if you're trans, or and that's where you start to hit the people call it the hierarchy of oppression or the oppression Olympics, and what really defines wokeism is the belief in standpoint epistemology. So you or I might say, okay, I believe that black people are oppressed. Okay, so how do we prove that? Well, we could look at things like income levels, or we could look at rates of incarceration. And of course, if we look at rates of incarceration, we can look at, well, what are actual rates of criminal activity? And if we look at income levels, well, we could say, well, what are comparative hours worked, or comparative education levels, or but we would be looking for evidence, and then we would determine, are black people oppressed or are they not oppressed, right? And we would form some conclusion. The wokeists use standpoint epistemology, which means that your belief in using evidence is itself a form of oppression, right? If somebody asserts that they are oppressed, well, then they're oppressed. You just can't see how they're oppressed. So it could be Oprah, a billionaire, interviewing a literal princess, and they can talk to each other about how oppressed society, how oppressed they are by society. And if you say, but you're a billionaire and you're a princess, you're participating in the oppression, right? Because you don't have the authority to discount their lived experience, right? So it's
unless you're oppressed further.
Unless you make the case that you're oppressed further, yeah. So if you can make that case, and that's where really it doesn't hold water at all, because ultimately you wind up pointing to some kind of evidence that you're more oppressed, even if you want to say, well, look at the historical black experience in the United States, and that's why Oprah, who's a billionaire, is more oppressed than you, or that's why Oprah, she's a woman, and so she'll always be more oppressed than you, who are a man. But you draw upon historical evidence then, and so it always falls apart. Yeah, if you engage in good faith discussion, which they don't, it's a semantics game. So
fun.
Yeah, I don't know. I just covered a lot of ground there.
You did, yeah. I was gonna say that was right in there. No, actually, it was funny. Is we routed all into that, and I was gonna come back to Panama Canal issues.
Yeah.
Circling back to go to back into the geography.
No, and we talked a little bit about that.
Slightly, but we didn't get specifically into it. But that's a significant thing. I know that China's slowly moving in on the Panama Canal, like influence or whatever what's
Right.
going on. And obviously that's the only place that we can cross between the Atlantic and the Pacific unless you go all the way down
through South
through
America, around South America.
South America. Yeah. And so obviously that's almost a bigger deal than Greenland. I mean, Greenland's a big deal, but like that is immediate. Like if something happens there, that's a whole like that can spark an invasion. Like that could like, hey, we're just gonna take over this part, and or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But what's the history behind that, and then why are they pointing to that right now?
Well, first let me say this, just in evidence of its significance. Do you remember a couple years ago there was a cargo ship on a what canal was it?
It was the Egyptian Suez.
Yeah, it's the Suez Canal,
And it went
sideways, and and all of a sudden supply lines everywhere around the world started to shrivel up.
Yeah.
So and we ended up with those where you had like cargo ship after cargo ship out. They had those pictures of like Los Angeles, and there'd just be like cargo ships as far as you could see waiting to get into port. And stuff. So it's the canal is significant. The canal was started by the French, who failed to finish it. Teddy Roosevelt is most associated with it, building it, although it wasn't just him. It continued after he left the presidency. But basically, the United States then built the canal. And we got the land to do it because we sponsored Panamanian rebels who overthrew their Nicaraguan. So we're the reason Panama has independence. Mm-hmm. And then after we built the canal, we operated it until the Carter years, where we gave it back to Panama to maintain basically as a neutral. Panama can operate it as a neutral. That was the agreement. As a neutral party, basically. And what we've seen is more and more Chinese influence over the operation.
But we invaded Panama in '89 then.
In '89 then, because we had handed it over to them, and we didn't feel that it was that our agreement with them was being honored, we invaded and overthrew Noriega. And so now the Chinese have asserted more and more influence there. So the question is, how do we address that? And, do we overthrow the Panamanian government? Do we build a different canal? That could potentially happen. I don't, through Nicaragua or something. I mean,
that'd be wild. But
we have the technology.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I there are definitely options, and there's no reason to believe the military option should be taken off the table. We've exercised it before. The bigger concern now is if the Chinese really consider that to be theirs, or if they consider themselves to be the defenders of an internationally neutral canal under their prudence, the same way that we would, assert, yes, we're operating it now, but we're operating it in the world's interest. The Chinese would probably say something similar. Mm-hmm. Would that lead to Chinese support for Panamanian defense forces, or Chinese support of Panama in the face of? Would we wind up with a direct confrontation between the U.S. and China over Panama? Mm-hmm. So
well, and it feels it's crazy too when you think of geopolitics. But that seems the most honestly that could escalate, or it's so significant.
Yeah,
because it's like when it comes to trade, like. It's like, okay, Panama's, but then at the same point, Panama can also be like, well, who's going to give me the better deal? And without escalating into conflict. Well, but at the same point, though, it could escalate on the aspect of like, look, this is actual shipping trade.
There's no reason to believe we go right to war. I mean, this could be something where we just put some pressure on Panama and they say, yeah, well, we're going to divest the Chinese component and we'll allow U.S. buyers to take over, whatever, however you might formulate that.
Yeah.
But we wind up in a situation here as well where it's like, well, do we talk to the Chinese and split the world into hemispheres and say, kind of like the Portuguese and the Spanish did with the New World, is like just say, all right, well, you own this longitude over, and we own this longitude over, so we're the West Hemisphere, you're the East Hemisphere. Do we do we wind up with some kind of an arrangement like that? So and what does that mean for Taiwan?
Yeah. Which is also, that was a big issue this last summer, especially with Russia invading in 2022.
Yeah.
Like some people thought that China might make a move on Taiwan. Although I do feel like China does play geopolitics a lot harder than like Russia did. Russia's like, I was going to invade.
Yeah.
But like Chinese are very calculated. An invasion of Taiwan just seems maybe imminent, but also at the same time, that would cause a lot of ripples into the U.S. economy. You know what I mean? Like the U.S. ties to China are very heavy.
Yeah.
So to go to war with them, or to have our ships start blasting away at Chinese warships, that's a war I don't think they want. I think they're much more vulnerable than people believe they are. Just like Russia, up until the Ukrainian war, was much more they have an adversary.
Yeah.
And then you realize how much of a paper tiger they were.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, truly. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not lethal, or I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not willing to put the effort in. I don't think China has. I think they're not as lethal as we think they are, or not as big as a threat. I think that's why they tend to bend more when we start putting pressure on them. Because why do they want to give up the biggest economy? Why do they want a war with us? Why do they steal our technology? They have complete ghost cities. Their economies collapse multiple times. You know, and also when you start fracturing China, and that's ripe for the U.S. to start sending guys in, putting some little bit of revolution in people's ears. You think you're going to handle all that? Now granted, it's a different culture, it's a different thing, but they're in a hybrid, and they know they're in a hybrid. They're not completely communists. They're obviously not completely capitalists, or believe in complete freedom. But they've found a way to keep moving on that 100 years plan. We have 4-year plans. They have 100.
Listen.
I mean, but they can though. They can operate on or even not 100, 20 year. Think of 20-year plans. Think of 10. We only have 4 to 8.
I mean, China couldn't even anticipate what the one-child policy would do 30 years out. I mean, so people say, well, they've got a 100-year plan. It's like, well, yeah, they killed all their kids, and now they're like, well, we don't have any people. It's like, well, what did you think was going to happen? Whenever people say, well, remember, China sees everything in 100-year cycles, or they have a 1,000-year vision, it's like, yeah, I mean, they're still human beings.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
And so the political cycles don't impact the fact that human beings don't have that kind of foresight. And that's why the central planning of an economy like China's fails, is because they can't anticipate every possible consequence that these things are going to have. Again, down to something as simple as, well, we're just going to kill all of our children.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, now you have a demographic collapse.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. That's why I agree that they're not as big of a threat, I believe, than what people make them out to be.
I would also point out
they're adversarial, but I don't think they're as big of a threat. Like, if they're like, oh, we're going to war. I don't think we'll ever go to war with them, because they couldn't sustain it. Their economy would collapse, and then you start fracturing.
We never went directly to war with the Soviets during the Cold War either. I think the question is more like, would we back one group with weapons and training, and the Chinese back another group with weapons and training? What would that look like? But the other thing I think of with China when it comes to, like, say, Taiwan, is they can still barely contain Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So the idea that they would, I have no doubt they could conquer Taiwan, so to speak, in 48 hours or whatever, overthrow the government and leave them totally leaderless. But what do you do then? I mean, it's like you've got a population that does not want to be occupied.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. That they're from understanding, that's a very mountainous region too.
Yeah,
like that's not like it's just a flat island. Like you're like, oh man, it's kind of nice and flat. No. Like, there's parts of it that they can only hit like one spot, because it's like just mountainous cliffs. Like, it's not going to happen.
Well, and Hong Kong was handed over 30 years ago, and they're still having. Still having?
I thought that was back like 10 years ago.
Hong Kong?
Yeah. What I'm saying is, like, when Hong Kong, wasn't there some district that the British gave up?
Hong Kong.
Was it? Well, no, but it wasn't 30 years ago. I thought that was like within the last 10.
No, it was 97.
No, there's something that happened. It was like the last bastion. It was like, it must have been a smaller part of Hong Kong then, because this was like only 10 years ago that something happened where it was like a big deal and we did nothing about it. It was like, I don't know what it was.
So the people in Hong Kong have on a couple of occasions risen up.
No, but there was that the government, like, they just like gave up the government, or it was something weird. I thought it was within the last 10 years.
Well, China. So as part of the UK handover of Hong Kong, they were given certain assurances for autonomy that the Chinese government then every few years takes more and more of those autonomous liberties away. And so, like, you ended up with that umbrella protests. That was probably about 10 years ago, where everybody went out with I think they were yellow umbrellas, right? Everybody went out and started occupying the streets with those.
Yeah, it was a big thing. It was all over the news. Yeah. I remember Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I think that was, if I recall, that was specifically with whether or not the people in Hong Kong could appoint their own judges or something like that. And the CCP said, no, we're going to do that from now on. And so they protested, and then, they got cleaned out after a little bit, and then, we're back to back to square one, and now the Chinese are going to do something again, no doubt that further imposes the CCP control over Hong Kong. So.
Yeah, which is, again, it's this weird. They're this hybrid. When people start talking about them and their economy, it's like they're not obviously not completely communist, but they take that higher dictatorship, but they also use capitalism to keep. It's almost like keep people happy. They steal technology, which is they offer very low cost of labor. They steal all our IP, but then they can recreate. It's like it is a hybrid of like it's just they're stealing. It's like the best, not the best of both. If you're a dictator, it's the best of both worlds. You're like, I'm getting everything I need. I don't have to use innovation. I keep my people oppressed, but just a little bit of happy, maybe a little middle class. Oh no, we're gonna oppress you. It's like they have like the system. Like there's an illusion of freedom with their social credit system, and like, oh no, not if you're good. If you're good, everything's fine. And like it's wild. Again, very utopian, obviously.
Yeah, and again, we kind of get into that when we say like, well, is China capitalist or are they communist? It's again, well, they're guided by Marxist thinking.
Yeah.
So do they feel like they've fully achieved the utopian communism that, or I should say, the scientific communism that Marx promised? No, they clearly feel that they're still in that dialectical progression. Mm-hmm. But even the Soviet Union, I think, had something like 2% of its farms left in private hands.
Yeah.
So has anybody ever fully achieved? Well, nobody's ever fully achieved communism, because communism is a theoretical state where a theoretical. I shouldn't say state, because that's communism is a theoretical status where the state has withered into nothing and all human beings simply collaborate intuitively. Mm-hmm. It's like
the human factor, which never works.
It never works. It doesn't, like your theory always fails. So at some point you have to reject your underlying premise. Mm-hmm. And so the Chinese managed to sort of provide people with more incentive-based decision making.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That was largely Deng Xiaoping. He used to say, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat. I care if it catches mice.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Nice. Good on that. All right. Next one.
All right.
Ending birthright citizenship.
Okay.
This is mostly hotly contested.
So, yeah, Trump just issued close to 200 executive orders, and this was one of them. Mm-hmm. I think 78 of the executive orders were rescinding Biden executive orders. So those don't.
I think he
totally
signed
count.
one that just said rescinding 78. It was
yes,
he didn't sign all 78. It was
right.
like, all right, these are the list, and we're rescinding them. But
as far as birthright citizenship goes, so basically, if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. Mm-hmm. is basically how it goes. However, what the 14th Amendment actually says is, if you are born in the United States and are subject to the laws thereof, or subject to the authority thereof. And at the time that was written, when we hear subject to the authority thereof, what we tend to think of is like, okay, so you're under their laws. Okay, so if you're born here, obviously the laws are applied to you, right? You're subject to the laws of the United States, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. There'd be no reason to say both of those things. Yeah. Born here and subject to the laws. Like, well, obviously if you're born here, you're subject to the laws. You can't just go around. Your parents can't just kill people. Yeah. Like what it actually meant at the time. The argument goes that what it meant at the time it was written was the use of subject. We don't really use it this way anymore. But you would have said like, I'm a subject of France, or I am a subject of England, or I am a subject of Spain. Well, if a Frenchman goes from France to England, he would still say he's a subject of France.
Yeah. Right.
So saying you are subject to the authority thereof means effectively like you are under that umbrella. You are under the Spanish umbrella, the French umbrella, the English umbrella, or
it's the diplomatic aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's like when kids come over and they're under diplomacy, they're under whatever diplomacy. Like they'll commit a crime and then they just bug out because they have
diplomatic immunity.
Yes, that's what diplomatic immunity. A little bit in that aspect. I mean, it's kind of an example.
It's kind of drawn that way.
I know what you mean. You're like, well, you're here, but you're under the.
It would be more like if you're born in France, but your parents are Americans. Mm-hmm. Well, you'd still be subject to America. You would be an American subject, even though you were born in France. Yeah. So the argument,
because most countries don't have this, correct?
Most New World countries do. Okay. Most Old World countries don't.
Okay.
And so, most Old World countries it's based on family lineage, and but I think it's probably just an artifact of the New World being settled by Europeans. Mm. We just sort of have this mindset that, well, if you're born here, this is where you're from, as opposed to the Europeans who have a much more, like, my ancestors were Swedish and German.
Yeah.
But I don't think of myself as Swedish or German. I was born in America. I'm an American.
Yeah.
Versus if your parents are Swedish and you're born in Belgium, you still think of yourself as Swedish in Europe. So, at least historically. I don't know.
So that's what so that's the argument. So it's not a very big line. But at one point then did that change? Because that if they wrote it one way, again, argument, like when did the law, or when did it say in our culture say that? But then people came here and they were born here. But again, the system was different. You were going off into the plains and people were dying left and right. So
And if you came through Ellis Island, you came through legally. You weren't entering America illegally. You came through Ellis Island.
I guess they didn't have
so
that.
It didn't really become an issue until we ended up with this sort of ease of transportation and the porous borders, and now you can have people fly in from Nigeria just to have a baby. I mean, it's it wasn't written with that level of travel in mind. So
And so what's how do you feel about? I mean, I shouldn't say how you feel about it. What's the legality of that then? I mean, look, they're going to take it to the Supreme Court,
right?
And
there's already been 2 lawsuits launched against it. So just signed the executive order yesterday. There's already been 22 states launching 1 lawsuit and 2 cities launching a separate lawsuit.
Which I get, I understand. I mean, that's how we've grown up, and I remember them talking about the anchor babies back in like the 2000s, you know. And but one point did people start raising that as an issue though? Was it the 50s, 60s, 70s? You know what I mean? Like at what time frame did people start discussing, because as far as we know, or as far as I know, I'm just common dude, where it's just like, oh yeah, okay, well you're born here,
I couldn't tell you exactly where that originated, but I think it was probably something that happened fairly organically over time, where once you started to see a few of these cases arise, it became, okay, well they were born here, so they're U.S. citizens, and it wasn't really something that became an issue.
Has it ever been taken to the Supreme Court at all? I mean, over in history?
I don't know that.
So this would almost be the first time.
This will be what settles the matter ultimately. Is if the president's. Well, and I shouldn't say that even, because it's possible that the Supreme Court could say that the argument versus about the language is correct. That is what we mean by subject, but should be interpreted out of subject. But the president doesn't have the authority; it has to come through Congress. Yeah. So. But one way or another, we should have an answer.
I have a feeling they're going to go through Congress is going to be the route they take.
Yeah, probably.
Because it's less controversial.
Yes.
I mean,
well, and for good reason. It takes a lot more public
Yeah.
consensus to get something through Congress
Yeah.
than to just get the president to issue it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which has not only a legitimizing factor philosophically, but also just in people's minds.
Yeah.
It's they feel as if they have participated in this, and therefore. Yeah.
Look, and I get it too. Like I do agree to some of that extent, because there is that point where like, well, you got here illegally. Like, all right, now I have this kid. Boom, now you're
right,
and you're like, okay, that was nefarious purposes. Like, and some people will argue, obviously. Like I said, when it comes to logic and emotion, people are like, well, they're just looking for a better life. It's like, well,
who isn't?
Yeah, who isn't though?
Yeah,
and do I get to go to Dubai and just
do I get to move into your house?
Yeah,
just
exactly.
Say, I'm just looking for a better life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, do I get to cash in on the UK or Ireland? Oh no, so that's what I mean. Like when you start going down that road, and people are like, well, to this extent, I was like, well, I understand why he's doing it. Like I get it now. Like I totally, especially with the again, this sparks the thought process. And I think that's probably what it's doing.
Yeah,
he signed it knowing it probably gonna get denied. But it will spark the conversation of, he's kind of right. Like, and
if it can scare people away for a couple of years while this gets resolved in the courts, all the better.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm saying is like, I think, and like, look, it is a different time. When people say, well, we're a nation of immigrants, there are different immigrants before.
Yeah, immigrant is not like a thing. Like there's a lot of different kinds of immigrants.
Exactly. Yeah. And by the way, the ones that came over here were absolutely determined psychopaths. Like that's not the people we're getting. Like those are the people who are like, hey,
I think we're getting a lot of psychopaths.
Well, no, I'm saying not in that aspect. I mean, expanding into the westward. I mean, like, can you imagine bringing your family and be like, your survival rate is like 50-50.
Yeah.
And be like, you know what? I came from England. I don't have land. You said I could have some if I make my stake my claim, but I've definitely got to fight for it. I'm probably going to die. But it's better than living in England or Ireland or any other place.
My ancestors came from
Sweden. Swedes, German, anything. Like that is a completely different type of people that came over to take risks opposed to what's happening now.
Yeah.
And I think everyone can agree on that. Because just saying that, they make more money here. It's like, but that's not, that means you get to break laws. I mean, that's like saying, I'm going to go to Dubai and I'm going to break the laws so I can bring more money. Not even to support Dubai's government, all the money's going back into Central America, wherever they came from. And like I said, immigrants are great. just do it properly. And I think that's really hard for some people to swallow. It's like, just do it the right way. You know, you can't just flow over. You can't just, except even the CBP1 app, they're like, well, it's legal. It's like, no, that's illegal. Like, they're not here. And by the way, all the parole, they would all get denied, but they stay anyways.
Right.
So you did the first part legal, and then you break the law, knowing that you're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So I understand why.
I'm also disgusted by the mentality. Did you hear that Episcopal priestess that
I heard about it? I didn't.
She was saying, these are just people who pick our crops. And these are just people who work the night shifts cleaning. And these are just, it's like, lady, like, they aren't a slave class. Like, why are you talking about these people like you're entitled to like their labor? Like, reminds me of that lady on The View, like during Trump's first administration when she said, if you don't allow immigrants in, who's going to clean your toilets? It's like they have no concept of the immigrants as like actually hardworking people who are trying to get a better life. They just see them as like
the slave class.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I get it. No, I did hear about that, and they're just like the JD Vance did the Jim from The Office, like, oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Like, what is that, by tradition? They go to that church? I heard something about it, like it's a tradition to go to that church after or something like that.
I think that's the one, it's St. John's, I believe, right across from the White House.
Shocking that it's political.
Well, that's the one that the Antifa rioters tried to burn down.
Yeah. No, I know, but still though, it's shocking that it's not, you have a female Catholic priest or whatever it is. Episcopal. Where it's like teaching, hardcore leftist Democratic rhetoric.
That is the Episcopal Church.
That's what I'm saying.
It is.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Is like it's in DC. They're not exactly going to be like hard Catholics there, or whatever.
Yeah.
But
the Catholic Church doesn't have women as priests.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Church
Like it's not like a hard,
Oh yeah, it's not a Catholic church.
Yeah. So, anyways, but how are we going with that? Yeah, because like I said, I think that's probably something that's just sparking the conversation now. And like I said, everything has to evolve, because
I think that conversation sparked and burned itself out. Like, you mean the immigration thing? Because I think basically everybody hears this now and is just like, shut up.
Oh yeah,
we've heard it for 8 years. Go away.
Yeah. No, I know that. I'm saying is the birthright one.
Yeah.
And I think again, people, it's funny because you either have to change and get with the times, or this is the way we always done it. So it's everyone's argument. It's like, well, we've always done it that way. It's like, well, don't you want to change and get with the times? Like, use the argument against them. It's like, well, no, this is a different time. Like, and this is probably the time we'd be like, okay, well, you can't just jump the border and have a kid. And, look, I'm all about like, even some illegal immigrants are like hardcore Trump supporters. They're like, yeah, we love the guy. Like, if he catches us and throws us back, like,
I knew this guy
but they'll be like, my kids. He's like, there's one guy they interviewed on CNN that was like, no, my kids they are conservative. Like, he's a Trump supporter. He's like, if they throw me back across the border, that's fine. My kids are here. Yeah. And I'm like, at least that guy admits it. He's like, he's like, they'll catch me. That's fine. My kids will be safe. They will vote conservative. They are Americans, and I get it if they deport me back. And like, I'm like, I'll take that. Like, I'll take that.
At least he's honest.
At least he's honest. Yeah.
I worked with this illegal immigrant years ago. This is before Trump. This was during the Obama years, and he hated Obama. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he was a Trump supporter. I mean, he couldn't vote for him because he wasn't a legal citizen. Well, maybe he was by that point. I don't know. But he hated Obama. He hated Democrats. Why? Because he was pro-life. He was an illegal immigrant, but he was from a Catholic country. He was Catholic, and he just was like resoundingly pro-life. So he hated Democrats.
Yeah. Which I think I think it's funny when people kind of put race into like certain bubbles. You're like, you gotta, and I think maybe just
when they said like, well, how did Trump win the Latino vote? It's like, look, you could one, like, yes, they're business owners. 2, they have conservative family values. 3, they're Catholic, whatever. Yeah. But I'm like, at the end of the day, can we also just point out, like, we've had issues with illegal immigration for like 40, 50 years now. Yeah. So they're Latinos, but they're like third generation Americans. Like, they don't think of themselves as part of some abstract concept of Latino-ness. Like, you know how people from like Guatemala don't think of themselves as like having anything in common with Chileans just because they're both from Latin America?
Exactly.
Well, I got news for you. Like, third generation Latino Americans don't see themselves first and foremost as Latinos. They see themselves first and foremost as Americans.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have an immigration issue for 50 years. They're not going like, well, my grandfather came here illegally. They're going like, yeah, my grandfather came here illegally. What a nut job. Yeah. I run a business now, and I don't want to have to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, or they're like, he came here illegally. I'm a legal citizen.
Yeah,
I vote conservative. Like, I have a business. He did what he did. We love him.
Yeah.
We vote, this way.
Do you stand by everything your grandfather did?
No.
No, I mean, like,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was when they talk about Cubans and like Florida.
Yeah.
It's like that is not the I think it was they're trying to do the
That's another one.
Latinx
When
one
you
with
have people
AOC
who came here specifically to get away from communism,
socialism, and they're
from
seeing it like through AOC. They're like, no,
Yeah.
then like they're like, I don't get it. They're Latino. Like it's not how that works. Like at all, Puerto Ricans are different from Cubans. Like
they didn't
Mexico,
grow up in a middle class Bronx family, but their ancestors were from Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
They came over on boats made out of tires.
Exactly.
And they were
escaping
like
communism.
they made a raft out of stuff in their house and then floated over.
Yeah.
They're not the same just because they have olive skin.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. No, and I agree. And that's the thing. I think it's a conversation starter.
Yeah.
And again, I think people are going to be emotional about it, but obviously they always are. But like, it is interesting because I didn't, when you go to the Constitution, you're like, well, things get changed, or not even changed, but things it'll most likely spark the debate. It's an executive order. So does that last then? I mean, how long does it take to go to the courts? Because he does the executive order. It said 30 days after he signed it. So it doesn't even take place till February, into February, whatever. So again, this is just me not knowing anything. Does that executive order keep going?
I think the court could. I think the court could issue an injunction that blocks it from
just blocks it in
effect.
general. Yeah.
But like you say, that this is one. It's the big ask, right? So I'm going to issue 200 executive orders. We're gonna see what stands up.
Yeah.
We're gonna consume leftist resources as they sue try to sue on this. That means that's money they don't have to pursue other legal cases. That's time they don't have to pursue other legal cases. So, and like you said, it starts the conversation. It starts us thinking about this. So, Trump is in a literal sense a leader. Like leadership isn't an office you hold. It's a character trait that you have, and he knows how to get people to follow him, and he knows how to make decisions. So
Trump 2.0, Trump 1.0. Difference.
Trump 2.0 is definitely more seasoned. One, I guess I'd say less naive. I love the picture of first term Trump, his official portrait from his first term, where he's just big smile on his face, and then the official Trump portrait of Trump second term here, where it's his mugshot. Yeah, he's clearly imitating his mugshot.
No,
face.
I listened to a podcast that was actually this guy I follow. He's a photographer, and he actually. It was really cool. He has his own podcaster, but he contacted the photographer that took the photo of Trump getting shot. Yeah, the one.
I think you were telling me about that.
Yeah, and it was a really cool podcast. It was not political. He was just like, "What'd you shoot it on?" Evan Vauci was the photographer, and he's like AP guy for like 30 years. He's been in war, knows exactly what to do under fire. So he was like, "I heard the shot." just the way he described it. He's like, "I got this photo." Did the specs nerd stuff, but then he talked to the photographer that did his portrait, and he was like, "Why?" And he's DM. It was actually just on Instagram. He's DMing him questions. He goes, "We wanted to do the mugshot. Like Trump wanted the mugshot. That's why it looks like the mugshot." He goes, "I wanted that. That was the most Google searched term in 2024.
Yeah,
that image was the most Google searched. So he's gonna make it that he's like, I want him to know that, and then they spruced it up with the lighting, topic.
Oh
top light,
it was
bottom light. It looks great. It actually looks kind of cool.
A lot nicer than the mugshot.
Yeah, it's a lot nicer. And it looks cool, but that's what even Trump said. That's what we're going for. Like this is not a mess around time. But yeah, anyway, so that's a little fun fact on the photography side. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd say that he's bringing in that again less naive, if I want to call it that. He knows people won't just follow his orders. Two, he made connections and built a network he didn't have in politics before.
Yeah.
Remember, he basically, his first term, he, called Reince Priebus and said, get me a staff. You know what I mean? And RNC just gave him, well, here's the people you want to have. And 90% of them hated him and wanted to undermine him and wanted him to fail. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have that this time. He found people who are loyal to him. He found people who were enthusiastic supporters.
Yeah.
Those would be the three things. One, he's got the experience to know how to navigate it. Two, he's not naive as to how tough a fight this is going to be. And three, he's he's got an army behind him this time and not people who are going to constantly undermine him.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it seems too, you've seen that. I won't say people go in lockstep, but they kind of are. And I think also too, cultural.
He's totally taken over the GOP.
Yeah.
I mean, you had Laura Trump as one of the co-chairs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Speaking of that, that's the one thing I was going to point out at the beginning of the podcast was the GOP in general with Laura Trump and with Whatley.
Yeah.
Or, I can't think of the guy from Utah. That's his daughter.
Prior to Laura Trump.
It was
Ronna McDaniels.
Ronna McDaniel.
His niece, I think.
He has his niece or something like that. I think we talked about that, and that was a big thing. We're like, you have to get her out of there. Like, and she was just like, whatever. I remember Vivek Ramaswamy talking about it on podcasts. He's like, why are you losing? Why are you here? And she got mad at him. It's like, well, that's, it's just like, are you trying to stab it? And obviously it was like, they're not fans of Trump. It was like, then you shouldn't be head of the GOP.
Right.
You should not be anywhere near this. And obviously they didn't, it was like, yeah, we're getting rid of it. And it is, you saw the ground game of 1.5 billion to 890 or 900 million, how
in terms of total campaign spending?
Yeah. Like the strategy, the way they, it was crazy. Obviously there's a lot of factors. I think culturally too, like, look, my wife, she's Democrat, but it's like at the same point, I remember when he won, she was like, well, we had him before. I think the extreme emotions are not the same. They're not the same.
When Trump got elected, so I guess not looking at not just Trump specifically, but like the state of the country, Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0.
Yeah. Culturally, everything's just different. It's a completely different animal.
Again, it's one of those things we were talking about COVID. Like it's almost hard to put yourself back in the mindset of 2020. But remember in 2016, every single poll said Trump was going to lose and lose badly.
Yeah.
And then not only did Trump win, but Republicans also won the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
Right.
And they botched it.
Yes, but that's not
the point.
But the point I just want to make is Trump could not win. He couldn't. It was impossible. It was saying Trump was going to win the presidency was equivalent to like saying, actually, it turns out your wife is a Frankensteinian monster. You didn't know this, but she was actually stitched together out of the corpses. It's like if that turned out to be true, you would have a total psychotic breakdown. Yeah. Like you would actually have a mental breakdown if you found out that was true tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like everything you knew about reality, everything you knew about the nature of your children, everything, like all of that would be. And I think it was Christopher Bedford who said, if you were an earth-worshipping urban feminist and Donald Trump wins the presidency, then your God has died.
Yeah.
You're in an actual ontological crisis.
Yeah.
And what actually happened was a total mental breakdown of a significant portion of the population who could not grasp that Donald Trump was the president. So it must have been the Russians. The Russians did it. The Russians actually did this. And actually everybody's a white supremacist because America's a white supremacist nation. Yeah. And actually we're going to put on these hats and we're going to go march in the streets. And it was a total mental breakdown.
Yeah.
And you don't have that this time. No. And it wasn't helped, I'll add. He lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College. Now, I'm not criticizing that.
No.
That's the system.
That's the game you play.
That's how it works, and that's how I want it to work.
Yeah.
But it also made that you knew Trump won with a minority of the vote. You knew Trump was unpopular in that sense. Like other people were, Hillary Clinton was more popular than Trump, right? It's a fact.
Yeah.
Like she got more votes.
Yeah.
And so the entire culture then was able to look at this and say, well, actually, most people don't like Trump. So you can have, not just news media, but entertainment media. And you can have restaurant chains. And you can have these, basically every corporate enterprise started to say like, well, we're going to cater to the majority that voted for Hillary Clinton. So they really fueled that delusion and that sense that we are the resistance. We're we're the underground here.
Yeah.
You don't have that this time because Trump, one, we've seen him before.
Yeah.
Two, some people were diehard believers that Kamala Harris was going to win, but certainly most people, even if they thought Kamala Harris was going to win,
in my own personal
it wasn't impossible. It wasn't presented as impossible as it was in 2016. And I think most people clearly most people thought Trump was going to win because most people voted for him. So, but
well, the other aspect though too, it was a different cult. It was Biden was fading. Even Democrats, all my family members were like, I don't know. Even they saw him after the debate. Like it was ignorance, not ignorance, but ignorance is bliss, or just don't even know because you don't pay attention to that. And I agree to what people say. Most people, 90% of people in the country, me and you are hardcore political analysts compared to anyone else.
Sure.
And even then we're not. We just like to listen. We're not balls deep in it like other people are. But most Americans, 90%, just watch Fox or MSNBC for 10 minutes and then they're out.
Right.
They're out.
And they might have one host that they watch while they eat dinner or
something. Yeah. And so everyone thought Biden was good. The rumors are, but whatever, that's just propaganda, and then the debate happens because
Cheap
that was
fakes.
that
They were
was
cheap fakes.
the
That
cheap
was-
fakes,
yeah.
yeah. And I think that's and everything was you had the Afghan evac poll. Everyone was affected by that, and you have family members that served there. You saw what happened. It was shown,
And not only not only that,
or the abandonment
itself,
of it.
Not
Like
only
it-
that
yeah.
itself, but do you remember Biden then came out and gave a press conference, and he started by just saying, "Tough day," and then he gave this very weak press conference about
Yeah.
it. And I remember the press started asking him questions. I don't remember what the questions were.
Yeah.
He was holding a binder, and he just took the binder and he just curled up like this. And he just stopped answering questions. And this was, early in his presidency.
Yeah, yeah.
And he just curled up around this body. And that was the moment for me. Obviously, I didn't vote for Biden. But that was the moment for me where I said, this man is not just a bad president. He's in over his head, and this is the moment it hit him.
Yeah, yeah.
Like he's literally just clutching this binder,
Yeah.
curling up practically in the fetal position.
Yeah.
Because he's suddenly realized, oh, I am at the top. Like he was vice president. Ultimately, Obama held, and he was in the Senate for 40 years. You don't have any actual responsibilities as a senator, right?
To what you do, yeah.
And he had been in a county commissioner before that. But you can always point fingers in any of these. It's like that was the moment he realized I can fail, and when I fail, there is no one else to blame but me.
Yeah.
And that was when he realized he was in over his head. That's what I believe.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Is that everyone saw that.
Yeah.
You saw the decline. You saw inflation kick up. Even like except I always kind of bring my wife up. Even my wife was like, "This is expensive." Like groceries. That was in the last
Eggs
year.
are like $7 a dozen
Yeah,
now.
gas went up, and then it was also Ukraine war becomes a massive topic because now we are on the verge of World War III. Trump was supposed to start World War III, and competency and complacency starts World War III. Which again, I've learned something new. I didn't think that's how that happened, but it does. You know, like you can't just say we don't want to participate or we don't whatever. You have to be strong because people are going to push you around, and that's what happened. Like
Biden didn't just say we're not going to participate. Remember, he said we will respond to an invasion unless it's a small invasion.
Yeah.
But what are you talking about, man?
Yeah.
Like show some clarity and some leadership.
Yeah. And then they invade, and that shows another huge weakness. This Eastern European war kicks off. Which, by the way, I've traveled over to Eastern Europe. I've been to Ukraine twice. Poland, this is very real for them.
Yeah.
All the nations that are on that border, this is very real. This is very World War III territory. This isn't just because the U.S. is so secluded. We don't think that way. But it's like I remember going over to Ukraine the first time and then hearing the debates coming back, and I'm like, oh, this is how World War II started. I was like, this isn't our war. Was World War II our war? No, it wasn't. It's the European and Japanese theater. Like, is that our war? Do we care? Is it that big a deal? Is Britain that big of an ally to us? You know what I'm saying? Like you start hearing these things start to come as like, well, who cares? Ukraine's super corrupt. Who cares? Blah, blah, blah. Who cares? It's just Russia. Well, Russia's not that. Maybe they have a reason to invade. It's like this weird thing. And then when I'm there, I'm seeing people getting massacred. You know, like you're thinking, you thought the Taliban was bad. You look at what's going on in Ukraine, the amount of mass casualties, the amount of graves they dug out while I was there, the executions, even the people we were trying to evac, they murdered their caretakers. And so I had a guy on a bus that was driving these kids around in circles. It's like, it's insane. Yeah. And so, they literally leveling buildings with civilians in it, like no recourse. And people are just like, wow, the Ukrainians, they're like, they're kind of corrupt, and that was coming from all sides, but like, or I should say that not all sides. A lot of people support it, but then you started seeing the loud voices, like in the GOP. Like when I talk about the Ukraine and the GOP, is this really weird thing of like, here's this war that throughout the Cold War, through any conservative mind, is like this is the war that we need to back because it's Russia invading a country, all this other stuff, and now they're like, well, that's not our. Why aren't we using the money to put to housing? It's like, you start hearing like the popular commentators like Charlie Kirk or whatever the others, like, dude, back off the whole Ukraine like aid. We should have gave it to North Carolina. Like that. It's just like when people bitched about the Afghan war and we're like, well, why can't we? It's like the leftists or the Democrats were like, well, we could use that money for our schools, for free healthcare. Guess what happened? Nothing. Nowhere. That money goes nowhere. Do you get free healthcare now? No, you don't. Do you get free college? No, you don't. Do you get free anything now? No. That $3 billion actually kept, or whatever we were sending, was keeping something from collapsing. And sometimes that's all the reason you need, because now it's a black hole. Now you have multiple terrorist units just thriving, and we were sending them $20 million a month to the Taliban and through NGOs. and now we're funding terrorism. Like, it's insane. And so, and now you look at Ukraine, you're like, hey man, like, you just help there's no blood being spilt by the US. It's just our weapons that, by the way, we haven't been using. The money is going back to us. So we have a $100 billion package. Most of that money is coming back to us to rebuild our stock of our stockpiles, but then we obviously going to send them over. So it's like
there's where you wind up with Eisenhower's military industrial complex.
Yeah, but I don't think the CEOs are going, what we need to do? We need to when Russia invades Ukraine, because we have experience, or, all this, we need to go to war with Russia. It's like, no.
I think the CEOs love that we can send our old equipment there.
Oh, no, that's what I'm saying. They love that. Yeah,
they love it because they're making bank off this.
That's what I'm saying is, like, people think that the military industrial complex is like right there. We need to start more wars.
They don't want a world war. What they want is a perpetual proxy conflict to burn
that's what I'm saying.
through.
When people start talking that way, it gets kind of annoying. It's like that weird straw man, like, military industrial complex. Well, of course they love war, because that's where we get to use their artillery and tanks. Yeah, of course they do. But I don't think they're sitting there like, what we need to do? We need to invade Panama, or something. You know what I mean? Like, those are still policymakers. Say what you will about lobbyists. Like, it's still like an idea. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, Lockheed Martin didn't go to Bush and say, what we need to do? We need to invade Iraq. We need to invade Iraq.
Yeah.
WMD's, man. And Bush is like, you know what? That CEO of Lockheed's got something to say. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's that weird mentality. I don't know. Or that's a little bit of a straw man when people start speaking in vagueness.
So what I would say is, I'd say that generally speaking, the GOP is opposed to the war in Ukraine.
Oh, opposed to the war, but they support, a lot of people support sending weapons over. They not? I think so.
I'd say, when you say a lot of people support it, it's a party of 100 million people, so it's like, there's
true.
a lot of people who do, but
yeah.
But no, I'd say that's a pretty. I'd say it's maybe like 30%.
Yeah.
I go to town hall meetings here in Minnesota, and
Ukraine's a pretty big issue.
You can find one person who supports continuing to fund Ukraine. Yeah. The difference that I would say, since you put it in the context of, like, during the Cold War, we would have backed anybody. And that's because during the Cold War, we had that strategy of containment.
Yeah.
Marxism is an evangelical religion. It is a religion that the Soviet Union was trying to spread around the world. Russia clearly isn't trying to spread any kind of ideology around the world. Yeah. They're just invading a neighboring country. I'm not saying that to dismiss the suffering of Ukraine. I'm just saying it's a different nature of conflict. Yeah. I don't think Russia has legitimate claims to Ukraine.
Yeah.
That said, if I say it's not our war, it's like, well, I don't believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine and then invade Estonia and then invade Latvia and then invade Lithuania and then invade Poland and then invade Germany. I don't think that's going to be what happens. I don't, if for no other reason, the fact that those countries are already in NATO.
No, that's why I agree with you. That's why they're not invading them. Right. So when people make the argument of, like, well, Ukraine wants to become part of NATO, it's like, well, yeah, why wouldn't they? They don't want to be invaded.
Yeah.
They're like, well, we can't let them in. I was like, what are you talking? That's the reason. That's the only reason Estonia stands right now is because it's part of NATO.
Right.
And they also border. So the whole thing of, like, well, NATO's encroaching on Russia, I was like, yeah, of course it is. That's the point. Like, and again, Ukraine.
Well, the point of NATO was supposed to stop Russia from encroaching on Western Europe.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying they are bordered with them.
Yeah.
So this whole excuse of, like, well, NATO's getting close. It's like, NATO's already there. NATO is on the border of Russia. Like,
but there's a difference between being on the border and being surrounded. And when Russia feels that every one of its borders is increasingly surrounded by NATO allies or U.S. allies, they feel increasingly isolated.
Yeah.
And so I don't.
Well, the thing, but that's the thing. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, though, look, they moved into Crimea. They took over Crimea. Yeah. Georgia. Yeah. Like, that's the government. I know the people hate the government, but what I'm saying, they're like in this weird thing right now.
But there's another great example. I wouldn't have said let's pour all of our resources into Georgia.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have said that's our war either. I don't. I don't think it was.
Well, I think it's a little bit different because Georgia's cut off from everything. Like, Poland borders Ukraine.
Sure.
Because I talked to a Georgian fighter. Like, he's awesome. Viking. And but they
look, anybody who's killing Russians is okay in my book. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
What I'm saying is, like, in the beginning of the GOP,
Yeah.
at the very beginning of the war, most people were supportive, like, hey, we need to help them out, or we need to send weapons. And then there was a vocal minority. Now, 3 years later,
during the Crimea phase, the Crimea phase back in 2014.
I'm saying even now, back in 2022, most everyone was supportive of it. But then it starts becoming when months and years drug on, then it became a political talking point of, like, why are we sending all this money? And I get it. I get it.
I didn't see that level of enthusiasm for funding the war once Russia began its main invasion. Crimea, yes, I absolutely.
Yeah, I remember Crimea.
Everybody was saying, why aren't we sending them lethal aid? Why aren't we cutting off I said we should pressure. Turkey's a NATO ally. We should pressure Turkey to close the Bosphorus Straits to Russian traffic. Like if they want Crimea to have a naval base, then let's make it a worthless naval base where they can't get out of the sea. But so we had. I said we should have immediately dispatched engineers to start planning nuclear launch sites in Ukraine. Why? Not so we could build nuclear launch sites in Ukraine, but so that we could give up nuclear launch sites that we didn't want and that we didn't even build as a bargaining chip, so that the Russians would be willing to make sacrifices of their own. But no, once the main invasion of Ukraine started, I did not see that same level of enthusiasm.
Oh, see, I did. I remember everyone was on the same team.
Well, everybody was pro-Ukraine, but I didn't see that level of enthusiasm of let's get them Abrams tanks and let's get them...
No, I don't think so either. No, in the beginning of the war, no, I agree. Because no one knew what was going to happen. It was
to be frank, we all assumed Ukraine was going to collapse in a couple of weeks.
I was there. I was like, I don't know how long this is going to last.
Yeah.
But no, and I agree. And I think as it dragged on and more stuff was going on, then you start seeing the support starting to get kind of weird, wonky. Like you're like, okay, cool. And I understand what people are saying, but at the same moment, you're like, okay, man, like you have a hostile entity per se. You have an aggressor, Russia.
Yeah.
And again, they're not communists, but you do have Ukraine. You do have, it's a free sovereign nation. And I think the excuses on people wanting to back out it completely or being like, well, I don't know why we're pro-Russian. Why don't we let them? It's like, well, no, dude. Like you saw what's going on.
Well, I'm not going to go the whole Tucker Carlson
no.
Look how clean the subways are.
Well, that's what I'm saying is there's very, very much that started becoming a popular talking point. And I don't know. And again, I think it's more a political talking point than anything. Like you see Trump's going in now. He's like, I have made a joke. They're like, oh, you said you're going to solve it in a day, like yesterday. And he's like, I have a half day today, so that a half day tomorrow. I was like, he's not doing it in a day.
Right.
In fact, there's going to be a lot of complications. There's still a lot of stuff going on.
And keep in mind too, Zelensky and Putin did have a peace deal ready to go that Boris Johnson told Zelensky to torpedo.
Yeah.
It's like, so we already had an off ramp years ago that now we're stuck with this.
Yeah.
Why was Boris Johnson interfering in this? I mean, why, if they were both, I'm obviously not happy, but if they had reached a point where they said, all right, we can end this.
Well, also though too, I mean, the aspect was, well, one, we wanted to bleed Russia. That's why we did it. We wanted to bleed Russia of its resources.
Right,
yeah. And I think too, when it came to that, it wasn't a peace deal. It was a surrender deal because of how much land the Russians had and how much they lost right after that. So I think it's just one of those things where Zelensky back against the wall was like, okay, are you in those early days? Are you going to back us? Because they knew it would. They weren't going to be able to sustain without more stuff coming in. They only had so much supply. Like whether because I know guys that fought there now. They're like in the beginning days. They're like, yep, that the stuff that we sent over that was already there and then it started coming in, that made the difference. Back then, like I said, I think it's one of those deals where like, are you going to back me? I don't think it was just Boris comes like, you're going to keep fighting. I think there was a negotiation. Zelensky saying,
if Boris said something to get him.
Yeah, but I'm saying if Zelensky goes, I don't want this deal because Russia at that time had significant swaths of land that the Ukrainians then retook very quickly. I'm not talking about like way back into the eastern side. I'm talking like pockets around Kyiv.
Yeah.
Like there was like, because they sent them in through the airborne, there was just units. I mean, you want to start giving that up. Like, and so I think it came to the aspect of if you get us weapons, you get us supplies, we'll keep fighting. If not, it's going to turn into an insurgency. It's going to be an absolute shit show.
Right.
It's going to turn into like Chechnya.
Yeah.
And then Boris goes, of course we'll give you. We want to bleed the Russians. Okay, cool, keep fighting. But it was a surrender deal. It's not like Zelensky was like, yeah, this is a great fucking deal. I mean, they would have lost like half of Ukraine and to an insignificant force of Russians. Like, because it didn't take long for them to push them out of the hospital airport. It did not take them long to get pushed out of Irpin, especially Mashun. Within a month, they pushed them out of Kyiv, or not even in Kyiv, around Kyiv.
Yeah.
So. And by the way, Kyiv is not far from that border. So I think that's the aspect when it came to Ukraine, when people started, I think it was a popular talking point to then, again, it was weird to see the GOP kind of go in that direction. Because typically that comes from Democrats. They're like, why are we funding a war? Why are we, you know what I mean?
Typically the Democrats vote for us to go to a war and then immediately start complaining that we have to pay for it.
I think
this is something where the GOP, especially under Donald Trump, has really reformed into a much part of the America First agenda is like, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to be the world police. We're not going to get involved every time some nation invades another nation. We're not going to try and. And so when you look at this, I think that there's just a level of like, what is our interest here?
Yeah.
Aside from we can bleed the Russians, which even that, it's like if we bleed the Russians too much, you wind up with a politically unstable Russia. That's not beneficial. Like somebody overthrows
them-
Putin, it's not like all of a sudden we wind up with peaceful democracy in Russia. Or
No, I
something
agree,
like
but
that.
I mean,
So-
the fall of the Soviet Union, what did it do? It's just splintered in all the countries into the tribes or whatever, or
Well,
in those ethnicities.
Yeah, but those countries that existed within the Soviet Union, I
know, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
As
but
opposed to like, so let's say they depose Putin. We bleed them so much that there's a coup and they depose Putin. Like, okay, like it's not like all of a sudden that means we're in a great-
it's nothing's ever
So-
like bloodless
and,
or
and-
like.
and again,
easy.
the reason for defeating the Soviet Union was to crush the Marxist doctrine,
Yeah, yeah.
not specifically we just really hated
I agree.
Gorbachev. It was
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying is I just think when it came to it also came to Biden's in power, everything opposite of Biden mentality. It's like, oh, well, he supports Ukraine and sending weapons. I don't like doing that. I'm like, bro, you were like
that
for
definitely-
continuing the Afghan war fucking 6 months ago because Biden wanted to end it. So pick a fucking
Well,
line.
I don't think that's quite right either.
well,
First,
but
the
there's
Afghan
a
war
good-
was different because we
Yeah, it's
actually
different, but
we were actually engaged in that
But regardless,
war.
in politics, whatever the opposite your teams does, whatever the opposite team does, you do the opposite. That's what I'm saying. It's like when you could tell people were united for a little bit, but as soon as because it was under Biden, if they invaded under Trump, the Republicans would be the biggest like.
I don't know. When Trump starts talking about vaccines, he gets booed at his own rallies.
No, see, what I'm saying is like if that had happened under Trump, the 100% most Republican Party would be like, you're right, we gotta help Ukraine.
If it had happened under Trump and Trump had
then
said
that's
we're
different.
going to invade, then or we're not going to invade, we're going to provide whatever kind of military support, then yes, the Republican Party.
That's what I'm saying. Like that's
behind
what
him.
I'm saying. Like that into that simplicity.
But
That's what I'm saying.
if Trump came out tomorrow and said we're going to send U.S. troops to
Oh,
fight in Eastern
no.
Ukraine,
That's a different world.
He'd
3
have
years
he'd
ago,
have insurrection on his hands.
3 years ago was much different than the GOP today. Now, do I agree with him a little bit? Yeah, a little bit. I think the whole isolationist thing is like a bit bitchy, but I get it. Like I understand why. Like I get why the Charlie Kirks or the Tucker Carlsons take. The like, why is our war? Because we are.
Yeah.
We are the number one power, which means we
But
have to be. We have to be.
To Charlie's credit, I think he has a different take than Tucker.
Oh, no, I agree.
Tucker's much more just contrarian, and so he's like full on like, well, look how cheap natural gas is in Russia.
Exactly. Yeah,
versus Charlie Kirk, who's more just like, this is not our war.
Yeah. But here's the thing, though.
Let Slavs
is
kill
if
Slavs.
if you're number one, you have to take. You are the world's police. Like whether you like it or not, you have to keep the stable. You have to keep things stable. Like you do. Like otherwise, then fine, pull out everything and just there would be massacres. I mean, there already is enough issues in the world. So if you really truly are like, okay, well, if we want to go completely isolationist, which is a terrible idea, because then China and Russia start moving on territory. Were we not talking about Panama Canal and Greenland? You can't be an isolationist. You can't. Now, I'm not saying you have to invade everywhere, but you still have to be participating in a lot of things, and that means the proxy wars that are out there. It means you have to have some sort of say. Because sometimes, America carries a lot of weight, and I think that is.
Let's play off that. So America carries a lot of weight. Would not have been a potentially viable strategy for the United States to launder military support through third-party NATO nations or even third-party non-NATO nations to keep the Ukrainians supplied with some necessary components of war, while being able to maintain an image of aloofness that would allow us to negotiate a peace between Russia and Ukraine.
I don't. In the 80s, you could have. You can't do it now. Information's too fast. I mean, you're talking about different technology. I mean, that's it was also, and the war was moving way too fast. I mean, literally, they were. Again, I was there. I mean, you're having supplies coming in left and right. And again, this is a conventional war opposed to an insurgency or tribal warfare. Everyone's used to the Middle East fighting each other, Arabs fighting each other, tribals. Things move slow. You give them like fucking $1 million, and they can help keep a territory. This is two nations going at each other. Things move way faster.
Yeah.
I don't think they could have hit it because. You're like, hey, why is there a bunch of U.S. javelins? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
it's saying we go to Germany and Poland and we say,
hey, you're gonna,
you guys send them, X number of Abrams, X number of fighters, X number of whatever.
I think it's too obvious.
And then in 6 months we resupply you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have.
I think
all it has to do is create an image of aloofness that will allow us to be in a position to negotiate.
Russia would know
that
though. I mean, everyone knows.
Well, sure, Russia would know that, but the point is they're able to walk away with a win. Like they don't. You have to make it possible for them to. What is our off ramp? Like at some point we have to. What is our exit strategy?
No, and I agree.
We're not even engaged. But we have to like, how do we end this war? It's like, well, okay, we can't. We're no longer a non-participant who can negotiate this. Even Switzerland got in. I don't think they sent supplies, but even Switzerland condemned Russia.
Yeah.
Switzerland, who used to be neutral.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay, so now who's left to mediate this?
Yeah.
Everybody has picked a side.
Yeah.
The North Koreans are sending troops.
Well.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
everybody has picked a side. So who's
Yeah.
left to mediate this? So now it's a very serious question. Okay, so
Yeah.
how do we end this war?
Yeah.
And if we are going to say like, okay, well, we're the number one on the block, then we still have that responsibility to figure out, okay, how do we broker a negotiation, and now how do we convince the Russians to come to the table with us as a mediator when we're funding
Yeah.
and supplying the guy that they're fighting? So
No, I agree, and I think all complicated, but that's just I hate to say it, part of the game, man. Like
Yeah.
nothing was ever easy, but I think the world that we used to know when it comes to like last 20 years with counterinsurgency and wars, we're all used to being, small groups, tribals, all that kind of stuff, being able to control the airspace. None of that's happening. I mean, we haven't seen a conventional war like this since like World War II, or that we're kind of now. You had Chechnya, you had a bunch of other
Africa.
stuff, Bosnia, Africa. But I'm saying is like to this scale, to this like real players going at each other on the Eastern European continent. It hasn't been seen in forever. So I think the way people talk now, they're like, well, how do we negotiate? And again, this is my harshness of when it comes to realities of war. You don't negotiate. You kill your enemy and you push them out of the territory. Is that not an option? You know what I'm saying?
I don't think it is. I mean, I just think in
No, I'm
practical
saying,
terms,
but that might be to the
as,
Ukrainians. If
like,
the Ukrainians say we can do this, you just need to get us the supplies, which I think can happen, but maybe not. Maybe the Ukrainians go, hey, we can only push them this far, but let's push them that way. Like there's so many options on the table, but the part that when people go, well, we need to negotiate with the enemy. Why? Why do you need to negotiate with the enemy? If you want to win a war, why would you ever want to negotiate? You want to keep them completely out of your country and be done. And now, hey, they might not be able to do it. Then, come to the negotiation table. Maybe we just want to end the war. But then you can't bitch about saying, hey, we're losing this land or whatever. So I think people have to look at this war and say, we're fighting a war. We're fighting a real war. And there's losers and there's winners. And people are going to die. And you have to understand what is your off-ramp. I agree. What is the off-ramp?
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of Ukrainians will tell you our off-ramp is kicking them out of the country. Okay, let's start there then. Because some will go and I've talked with Ukrainians about it. And it's funny, their reaction is what everyone does. And they know the truth. They're like, well, we want Crimea. I was like,
That's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I immediately said, I was like, you're not getting Crimea. I was like, you're insane. I was like, the West will completely stop supporting you and you will lose. And they go, yeah, we know. It's like, yeah, so you know that. But truly, a lot of them want to kick out the Russians out of the territories to go back to lines of 2022, February of 22.
Right.
Now, and again, I think it annoys us slightly with this is me being in our U.S. military for so long, and this is harsh to say, but I think that's why I like Pete Hegseth going in. So we'll see how he does. Obviously everything comes down to Trump, what he wants to do. But at the end of the day, just because you lose a tank doesn't mean the military completely stops. Like we're so used to this mentality of, oh my God, a Black Hawk got shot down. Fucking everything's got to freeze. Oh my God. Hey, we got to recover that one bird. What happened in Vietnam? There are pilots that got shot down multiple times on one operation, would jump in a Huey, they'd rescue him, hop in another one, and go.
Yeah.
You keep going. This focus on military equipment having to be so sensitive, Now, obviously, the other thing, too, I think what's really harsh is we're so used to it because we haven't fought a giant war since Vietnam. Like, you can talk about Desert Storm, you talk about Iraq, Afghanistan. Those numbers are completely minuscule compared to what was sacrificed in Vietnam, Korea, World War
doubt.
II.
Yeah.
And I think it's really harder for people to understand that with Ukraine. Now, it's not even our people, too, by the way. It's the Ukrainians. And they're seeing these numbers, and they're like, it's got to stop now. No, if you've lost this much, do you not want to win? You got to put yourself in what Ukrainians are thinking. We've lost this amount of people. Most people, like here in the U.S., are like, oh, we got to stop. Let's just stop. Everyone call it peace. No. If you've lost this many people, if you lost your family, lost everything, do you want to give up an inch of land?
Yeah.
You don't. You want to retake it all.
But I'm just saying the realpolitik of it is, you don't have the resources to retake Crimea.
No, yeah.
It's not going to happen.
No, I agree.
So
which none of them, they that's a wish. They know it's not
Right.
going to happen. Yeah.
So do you have the resources to retake all of the eastern provinces?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, one, you certainly don't without U.S. support. Two, even with U.S. support, at some point you run into limitations on just how many men you have.
Yeah. Well, that's what they were talking. This is a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah.
Is when I was there in July, I asked them obviously all these questions. They were waiting for the election, and so they're holding ground. They're just holding because they don't know. So they were waiting on whoever became president so that they can develop a plan, because you don't want to develop a plan and execute in the middle of an election where your biggest supplier doesn't know which way they're going to go. Right now, during the election time, Trump was like, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine on day one. They don't want to start an operation thinking that Trump's going to come in and cut off supply when they're successfully, by the way, I believe that they could successfully push them out. I do. Now, I might be wrong, but I think they absolutely can. I think they have the fight, they have the will, they do have the manpower, but they're not spending it right now. Because, look, when people were like, there's plenty of people in Kyiv to fight this war, but right now you can't send everyone to the front line and kill them off if this X factor isn't solved yet. And now if Biden was there, they might just be in where they are now, where it's just going to be a deadlock, because he's not given enough munitions to win, but he's not given enough munitions to lose. So it's that weird thing where Trump might come in and say, hey, you know what? I got Pete Hegseth. We've talked about it. We got anything you want. You can have it for the next 3 months, but this war ends in 3 months. That could be an option. I'm not saying it's a good idea to announce to the world, but that gives them an option. You'd be like, okay, then we can, it's up to you what you're willing to do, but we'll give you the supplies you need right now. So I think people just need to they've been used to small numbers of casualties. They're not used to what's happening in Ukraine, and they just want it to end no matter what. It's like, well, you still have to win. You still have to accomplish the goal, because no matter what happens, Russians will reinvade in 10 years, because they did it in Crimea. Right. They did it to Chechnya. Chechens, the Chechens massacred the Russians. And then they came back, regrouped, and they signed a peace deal saying you will never invade again. They came back with more guys, and they liquefied everyone. So you don't think and I think a lot of people don't quite understand the history of that. When the Russians say they're going to keep a peace deal, they're not. They're just going to come back. They understand that they screwed up the first time, which invasion of 22, and they're going to come back with more supplies ready. A lot of those guys do. That's the other thing too, which was on the side of the Ukrainians. They don't understand. People showed up with their dress uniforms in their bags, thinking that they were just going to walk into Kyiv. They didn't have enough fuel. They didn't even tell the guys they were in Ukraine, because they just thought that they were just going to take it. That if they actually maybe would have come in with a plan, you're looking at a different war.
But then where does that leave you in 10 years? If the Russians are just going to invade again in 10 years, regardless of the outcome here, then why not hasten an ending?
Yeah. I mean, but why don't you give time for the build-up? See, that's the thing. If in 10 years and they push everything out, and they won the war, now to Russians, they're going to be like, oh yeah, our special operation's over after 3 years and gaining no territory. Yeah.
Well, the Russians would say something like, "Well, we forced the Ukrainians to acknowledge our ownership of Crimea.
We killed all the Nazis
Then we killed all the Nazis
in Ukraine, so we won. Whatever." But I mean, obviously, once this war ends, we rearm them. They're going to be armed to the teeth. So I don't think that you're going to see a reinvasion in 10 years, or if they do, it's just going to be an knockout fight, because they're going to be completely ready for it. So I think at this point, the consensus is,
so if we arm Ukraine to the teeth, Ukraine, we arm Ukraine to the teeth. So look, Russia then goes into Kazakhstan.
If you want peace, then we go into Ukraine to say, hey, maybe we help you with war. Guess what? We get a lot of your resources. We get to keep you and prop you up. We put military bases there.
No, I get that. I'm saying though, the Russians are going to invade somewhere then, right? I mean, and you would anticipate that Russia is going to invade somewhere. So if they can't invade a NATO country, and Ukraine, whether it's in NATO or not, we've armed it to the point of imperviousness. Do they invade Kazakhstan? Do they invade Mongolia? I mean, because you're saying the Russians are going to invade somewhere, right? So,
well, possibly, if it's worth it to them. They invade Afghanistan, and we supplied weapons to Mujahideen, and they got eventually left. It's like Georgia right now. Now, I think because even they're actually the Georgian government, because it's Soviets or Russian. Well, I don't want to say Soviets, but you know what I mean. They're communists. They're Russian. The people hate them, obviously. And like the Georgian fighter that was there in Ukraine, the government there is actually scared, because it wouldn't take much to overthrow that government. I asked him one time, Viking, I was like, so what would it take for say the U.S. would support an overthrow of Georgia? He's like, not much. He's like, we have enough fighters here in Ukraine that are now the most experienced fighters in the world to go and reinvade, or not invade, it'd be like 600 guys going into Georgia, and he's like, I think he said he was like, give us 1 week and $20 million and we can make it happen. Now Georgia's different, obviously. I get it. But at the same point, though, I mean, look, it's when you go back to China, like I said, they're having influence around the world. They're doing whatever. When it comes to, we're not spending our own blood to do this. It's only, what's a lot of money? You're right, it is a lot of money. But at the end of the day, do you want to, I don't say help keep stabilization, but, help this, stopping Russian influence and Chinese influence, but Russia's willing to do it with violence. Then why don't we just pay the people that they're doing the violence to, them the money, them the supplies to do the violence back? You know, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, like, I guess when you talked about Ukraine, it's just, you know, it's one of those deals where you're like, okay, man, like, obviously we're picking sides. We're picking Ukraine over Russia per se, even though you're right, we are the mediator. It's weird that we're the mediator, but we're pumping money into Ukraine. It is a weird deal. But at, you know, the end of the day, they invaded. You know, we're here to help out the, you know, it's, I don't know if it's an idyllic stance, but it's like, yeah, man, they invaded. They were the ones killing the Ukrainians. You know, say what you will about corruption. Everyone's corrupt. You know, I think
all the more reason for us not to be involved with either of them.
But who cares? So the U.S. government's corrupt too. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, do we not?
I'd love to not be involved with the U.S. government.
But that's what I'm saying. It's like, at the end of the day, I think you still have to be involved. I don't say you have to world police. You don't have to send in people all the time. Yeah. But you have to be involved, drastically involved. You know, but who cares about the Panama Canal? Well, clearly we do. Who cares about the Suez Canal? Well, we clearly do. You know,
but I can point to why the Panama Canal directly influences U.S.
but that's not our
interests.
Country. It's not our country.
No, but it directly serves U.S. interests. I don't see why Ukraine directly serves U.S. interests.
But if are we going to go to war over the Panama Canal, though?
Sure.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Is like you can start making all these arguments.
I can explain why the war in Panama would benefit U.S. interests.
Yeah.
It keeps us the hemispheric hegemon. It creates, maintains U.S. trade in the region. Gives us control over international trade. Ukraine doesn't do any of those things, and it's not in our hemisphere.
Can provide us resources now. I mean, all sorts of stuff. We can talk about, like, because they have rich amount of resources in their territory. We can cash in on that. They're the breadbasket of the world. I mean, they provide like 80% of the European bread. You know what I'm saying? Sure. Like, we can come up with
get a lot more for Minnesota grain if it wasn't.
Well, I'm saying is, I mean, but I'm saying is there's a lot of excuses you can come up with. So I'm just saying, I feel like the whole, you know, and I get why people, they want to back off a little bit, and like I agree with that. You don't have to be involved in everything to the, you know, soup to nuts. Like, I agree with that. But when it comes to just being completely isolationist or just going like, that's not our problem, not deal with it, no, because it's going to end up being. Well,
I think that's a false dichotomy. I mean, like we've talked about how Greenland and Panama serve U.S. interests, so there's reasons for us to be engaged there. That wouldn't be isolationism. But we've also, you know, if what we're thinking about in Ukraine is it's going to stop a Russian takeover of the world, I don't think that's going to happen. If it's going to be that it gives us access to Russian grain, I think we're better off, or to Ukrainian grain, I think we're better off without Ukrainian grain, because it'd be better for U.S. farmers. We'd get better prices for what we produce if Ukraine stopped producing grain. And I think if we're talking about, and that's just being cynical, I'm not saying like, and then if we're talking about resources, I guess I don't know what mineral resources Ukraine is rich in, so there might be something there.
There's a bunch there,
Okay,
I have to get specifics,
yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. It was like, look, the invasion, them taking over, so say Russia takes over Ukraine, and then now they are on the border of NATO, Poland, right?
Sure.
Poland's part of NATO. You're right. Would they invade? Would they not? But it's a real threat. You know, like, it's still a threat. You know, they cyber hack Estonia all the time. Now, you're right. They are NATO. That's why they don't invade.
There's no kinetic action.
Yeah, there's no kinetic action. But at the same point, you're like, but why, you know, why take that risk? Like, you know, you're right. It's not our war. Who cares? You know, but at the same time, it's like, well, I don't know. You're just helping. You know, at the end of the day, maybe I'm just idealistic. Fucking help them out. You know, I don't know. It's bad guys invaded. Not so much good guys, but fucking help them out. Yeah. Whatever. I don't know. And I think that's when it comes down to, is like, why the fuck we care about Afghanistan? Why the fuck do we care about Iraq?
Well, we cared about Afghanistan because they were.
Well, no, I'm saying is, but you have
that had to do with 9/11.
But I'm saying it's like Iraq. Though. It's like, why do we invade Iraq? Why do we?
We were sold a lie on Iraq. We were told that they had weapons of mass destruction that they were going to.
But I'm saying is like, it's all the other stuff though too. I mean, it's like, why do we care about Israel? Why do we care about, you know?
Sure.
You know, we can argue this all day long, and obviously Israel's more idealistic.
I think we should, because that's how we're going to determine which causes to support that actually benefit U.S. interests. Whereas, you know, if we're talking about, well, who do we back in some civil war in Lesotho? It's like, well, I don't care. Can you explain how it benefits me? Well, you know, these guys were aggressors. It's like, well, I don't care.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not from Lesotho. That's
I say we back to the Lethosans. That's my take.
All right. Well.
Give them javelins, whatever they need. But that's me. That's just like, I you know, for me, I think helping out or whatever, like getting involved, doing something, you know, because I think when you look back at it too, it's like, well, you know, we look at World War II again. It's the biggest war. Why did we get involved? Obviously, the Japanese bombed us, right? And we also delayed going into that war. But why did we go to war in Europe?
Well, Hitler declared war on us.
Well, I'm saying, but who
Yeah.
cares? He's across the ocean. Who gives a fuck?
Well,
Well,
I know, but
if Russia declares war on us, why
It was
would we?
that was a tough sell Roosevelt had to make because we
Yeah.
got bombed by the
exactly.
Japanese.
Yeah, yeah.
Hitler declares war on us, and he says, "Well, we're focused on Hitler
But
first."
what we got, that's what I'm saying, though. You know what I'm saying? It's like, why?
But
Who cares?
Hitler had a pact with the Japanese, so
Yeah.
it was. I mean, we were
Yeah, I
at
know what
war
you mean.
with both.
Yeah.
It was we didn't choose it. We were at war with
Yeah.
both Japan and Germany and
Yeah.
Italy and
No,
Hungary.
I understand what you're saying, but it can still be in the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, you can still make that same argument. Like,
Yeah.
I think there is a point where it's like, you know what, you got to do, you know, you got to do the job. I think it's, I don't say good versus evil, but at that point, it's like, you got to do something to stop it, you know, or do something because it's not going to end well, you know, because look, and people can make this argument, like, what happens if we didn't get involved? What happens if it goes a certain way? Germany and East and Europe look completely different. You would never know about the Holocaust. Jews would be wiped off the map. You know, it's like, it's a completely different, you know, like it'd be weird to go to like Europe now and be like, oh, the Nazis, well, they won, you know, like that would be a wild timeline to live in. And in the countries around it, you know, it's,
and if we hadn't gotten involved in World War II, the Nazis may well still have lost, but the Soviet Union would have taken over all of Europe, and that would have been
or they would just call the lines, and there's like, hey, because that was another thing too, like. There's at one point the generals want to just stop where they were, which would, by the way, significantly devastating. You know, like if Hitler were just not been so psycho and been like, yeah, you know what, we got enough land, let's just hold it.
Yeah,
and America was ready to do that too. Like, all right, cool. I mean, that's also another third timeline that just, hey, we called it. You know, which again is you can put that into play. Why would the U.S. keep fighting if we have a peace treaty? You know what I'm saying? Like, well, now we know. I don't want to say all the atrocities, but like everything that happened.
Yeah, well, we didn't fight World War II to end the Holocaust.
No, I agree. Yeah. But at the same time, you're kind of like, well, you know, where's Poland go and all that? And now obviously the Soviets fucking took everything out of the Soviet Union. But it's just one of those things where I don't know, man. Like you look at it in the historical context. I think, you know, obviously we won that, so that was awesome. But you know, sometimes you know, people were itching to get involved for a reason. And there's always some people that are like, yeah, we shouldn't go. And I was like, yeah, I do agree. But sometimes you just got to do the right thing. Now, what does that look like to some people? You're right. I don't know. You know, I think doing the right thing is helping out the Ukrainians. Now, that's hard to pass the Congress, you know, like, I think it's the right thing. And you're like, you know, that doesn't mean, that doesn't hold a ton of weight. But at the end of the day, sometimes that's just what it is, you know, like you see a dude beating the shit out of a chick, you know, in public. Do you do anything or do you walk away? Not my problem, you know, or do you get involved? Yeah, that's a weird analogy of it, but like,
well, I mean,
you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just like, sometimes you just need to get involved and it sucks. It's going to, you know, but they're paying the ultimate price for it, you know? So I don't know. Obviously I think the Russians completely underestimated what's going on or what was going to happen. And it's, you know,
yeah, that much is clear.
That much is clear. Yeah. So, but anyway, that's my opinion on it. I don't know if it's a strong one, but
no.
But yeah,
and I would just to reiterate, I would say that is probably a starkly minority position within the GOP.
Probably,
so,
absolutely. Now it is. Yeah. I think now everyone just wants to end it. Yeah, and just be done with it. Which I understand. I do too. I'd be like, hey man, you got to end it. I guess just how you end it is going to be, you know, look, Biden ended the Afghan war.
Yeah, you can end it one way or another. Yeah,
it didn't end out so well. You know, it's like now we're gonna have an issue and we'll be back there in some way or some form. Now we have to nip it in the bud again. If we obviously decide to do that, but I feel like it's going to be an issue. You know, it's like right now the Israelis are trying to deal with the ceasefire and it's already going sideways. You know what I'm saying? It's like when people talk about like, we'll give it back to the Palestinians. Oh, like there's Hamas. There they are.
Well, that's where I've always, you know, growing up, it was always just, well, we need a two-state solution. It's like, you know, I'm not the most, you know, like elder of experienced worldly man. Like, I'm not, you know, the wise 90-year-old sage, but it's like, you know, I'm 38. I'm not the new kid on the block. Like I've lived through like countless cycles of ceasefire. Then Palestine starts bombing or raping Israelis. Israel responds. Then they're the bad guys because their response was disproportionate. And then there's a ceasefire, and then the Palestinians violate the ceasefire, and then I've lost track how many times we've gone through this in my life. There is no two-state solution. And I think that again, somebody's just gonna, I said this to you earlier about something else. Like at some point people just have to make unpopular decisions and just say like, there's not a two-state solution. this is all Israel now.
Yeah.
Like it's not working.
I think that was getting at. It's not popular.
Yeah.
It's what they do with Ukraine. It's not popular. Fight the war, kill as many Russians as you can, push them out. It's not popular. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like people will die. It's not a popular opinion, but that's what they want. But I agree with you too. I think everyone wants everyone to be happy, but losers don't get concessions.
Yeah. Well,
at the end of the day,
it's funny to me too when
especially when it comes to Israel, it's just like it's frustrating. And I know there's Palestinians out there. I know there's like I understand what they're doing, but at the end of the day, losers don't get concessions. The only reason that place is not a parking lot or made of glass right now is because the Israelis hold back. Yeah. I mean, like if there was an Arab state doing that, they would have wiped in. People would have been none the wiser. I mean, how many massacres? I mean, look at what ISIS did going through Iraq. They raped and pillaged all the Christians and no one blinked an eye. Yeah. And so you're kind of like...
Yeah, that's a good point. Nobody cared about the Christians. There was a little bit of concern about the Yazidis, but nobody cared about the Christians.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's the Western thinking of like, well, Christians...
Everybody's a Christian.
Yeah, everyone's they're the oppressors of the Muslims, or whatever. So I think that's why in the West, that's that they feel that way. It's the oppressor... the leftist thinking.
We're back to that.
Yeah, now we're back to that, which is full circle. But yeah, it's when it comes to Israel, I agree with you. I think it's a very unpopular opinion, but I think that Israelis have to make a hard decision either. And Egypt, no one's going to. I think that's the hard part. Is like obviously they're not going to wipe out the Palestinians, like put them against a firing squad. Obviously not. But where do you stick them? Well, and because you like no, this is Israeli territory now. Yeah, and then
where do they go?
But where do they go?
Because guess what?
Egypt's not taking them.
I was going to say Egypt built a wall to keep the Palestinians out. So it's not like this was an Israeli only thing.
The Jordanians don't want them. Lebanese don't want them. Like I mean, you can send them to Lebanon, maybe southern Lebanon, but.
Didn't they start a civil war in Lebanon?
They did. Yeah. But that's why half of Lebanon's shit and the other half is nice. Like if you go to, I think northern Lebanon, my buddy went there for the National Guard. So like the like other part's really good, but then there's one strip that's like terrible. They're like, do not go there. That's where all the terrorists are. Everything. Or not Hamas. Hezbollah is. But yeah. So it's like divided. But 100%. I mean, no one wants them. So and I agree. You can't just gun them down like
I know. Yeah,
obviously,
I don't know what the solution here is. Except I know it doesn't involve two states.
Exactly, it does involve two states, which is hard for people to swallow because it's just going to go back to that again. It just is, and
here's the thing: within Israel, you have Palestinian members of the Israeli government. You have Palestinians serving in the Israeli army. Yeah, you don't have any Jews in the Palestinian
nowhere, anywhere. Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that is such a crazy issue for and again, it's funny when people are like, oh, these refugee camps. They're cities, man. They're not people in tents, and so, but it is crazy to see that play out. But who knows? I mean, it's like I think people were even some of the. You do see a little bit of that, not a ton, but a little bit in the GOP is not anti-Israeli, but it's a little bit of like, why are we helping them? Why?
You have seen that start to grow.
You start to grow that a little bit.
And I don't know if you saw that the ADL just Elon Musk did that. The
Roman salute.
Roman salute, which I don't even think he was trying to do a Roman salute. I just think he was waving weird because he's a weird guy. I mean, like in terms of behaviors. And the ADL came out and was like, guys, stop it. This is not, he's not a Nazi. And then now, of course, AOC said, well, this just proves the ADL are like liars. And it's like, well, who cares? She just hates Jews. Yeah. But the ADL has now found itself for years, decades, attacking conservatives and Republicans, and now finds itself in a position where they're the only allies that it has. Like they failed to anticipate how much young Democrats hate Jews. Yeah. Like not just hate Israel, but are buying into like all of the anti-Jewish anti-Semitism. Yeah.
Well, it's tough because I even I think Democrats and moderate Democrats too are not caught with their pants around their ankles, but also I think came out of left field.
Yeah.
When MIT and Harvard are like banning Jews. Even my wife was like, "What the?"
Chasing them around the campus.
Literally, my wife was like, "Oh my God, what is happening?" And I'm like. How everybody thought it was like, Republican Nazi. It was like, no, it's not. It's leftist Democrats in the Democratic Party. And it's
because when there's actual anti-Semites in the Republican Party, they kick them out.
Like, exactly. We kick them out. We don't they're not a part of us. It's like Democrats, it was nuts because then nobody, and again, Democrat way, no one talks about it. So it's like this weird, okay, why are these hard Democratic educational institutions not letting Jews go to class, saying, "Hey, don't show up," because you know what I'm saying. Like this whole thing of
and
like
it's just like
kicking them out.
It's just like my story about my old boss earlier, where it's
Yeah.
like, well, let's just be affirmative action, and it's like that's not what it means. Like you don't know what it means, and it's like for decades now we've seen this move within the Democrats, especially among young Democrats, where it's like, well, actually Israel is basically a fascist police state engaged in ethnic cleansing. It's an apartheid state.
Yeah.
And really, and you look at it, it's like, well, white people have disproportionate amount of wealth, and Jews have a disproportionate amount of wealth, and white people are disproportionately in positions of power, and Jews are disproportionately in positions of power. Now, I don't care, me, Travis, personally, I don't care, but these people who are obsessed with everything
Power
being
dynamics,
equitable and power dynamics and equal representation based on demographics, it's like, well, they're looking at it and they're saying, well, geez, this means that Jews are the bad guys.
Yeah.
It's like, well, now do you see why Republicans were warning you about this for 30 years?
Yeah, exactly. Republicans like, we've always been fans, and and again, that hasn't changed in the Republican Party. They've always been big supporters of Israel, or Jews in general. But I think that was wild. Again, a wild time. I think when people look back at 2024, clearly was not a regular year. This was not. I mean, you said you had Jews getting kicked out of classes, or not saying do not come to class because there's people literally saying,
and remember,
which was wild. Because
even during 2020, during 2020, de Blasio was cracking down on Jewish neighborhoods.
Yeah.
I mean, and he was, because Jews were trying to go to religious services and things like that, and de Blasio was having them all arrested. I mean, it was just,
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. And then you obviously have the assassination attempts and you have all that stuff. So it's like, it was a wild year. I mean, it was a wild time. I think everything got turned upside down on its head. But anyways, now we are day two.
Day two.
See what day 3 brings.
I'm excited for the next 4 years. So.
All right, man. Well, this is great. This is the longest one we've done.
Okay. Well, I hope it was interesting enough to deserve that.
Hopefully. Yeah. I believe. Yeah. Everything. Yeah. It was fun, man. I think it was awesome. Thanks for coming on. And
thanks for having me.
Where can people find you if they want to vote for you or for whatever you're doing?
Well, I'm not running for any office right now, but I've got some non-political things. I'm taking a step back a little bit from politics this year. And my taking a step back still means I'm going to be going to a couple meetings a month. But not running for any offices this year. Got some other things that I'll be working on. So we can talk about that some other time maybe.
Yeah.
But,
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome.